An individual by the name of Luther Charles was seated on the weathered wooden steps of his parents' front porch in St. Louis, Missouri, on a weekday morning in the month of March in the year 1995. Despite the fact that the air was cool and sharp, Luther did not detect it. His full attention was zeroed in on the newspaper that was spread out across his lap. It had been several hours since his parents had left for work, and the sound of their vehicles rolling out of the driveway was a familiar and rhythmic departure that signaled the beginning of yet another day that he would spend at home. Luther was unable to find work. 5 years had passed since he had last had a steady employment. It wasn't because he was a slacker, rather, it was because he had a simple, all-encompassing dream. Luther had a dream of becoming an actress. During the course of a half-decade, he had committed every ounce of his existence to the pursuit of this goal. Rather than only daydreaming about it, he was actively working toward achieving it. Until his own face seemed like it belonged to a stranger, he went to every audition he could find, studied monologues while he was in the shower, and practiced facial expressions in the mirror of the bathroom. On the other hand, the reality was a cruel cycle of hope followed by rejection that kept repeating itself. He would enter a casting room with his pulse hammering, perform his lines with everything he had, and then receive a courteous but forceful, "Thank you, we'll let you know." However, they never did let him know. 5 years of this had left him absolutely bankrupt, and he was still living in the bedroom he had used as a child at his parents' house. He was a grown man who was still dependent on the generosity of his parents. However, the dream itself had not diminished in any way, despite the ongoing series of setbacks. When all else was considered, it had gotten more intense and more urgent. He was aware of what his peers believed. He could hear it in the way his relatives would ask, "So, any luck with that acting thing?" He knew they saw it as a childish fantasy, a pipe dream. They were of the opinion that he ought to be practical, acquire a regular job that required him to work from 9 to 5, and acknowledge that there are certain things that simply aren't meant to be. On the other hand, Luther could not even fathom such a possibility. At that moment, the thought of abandoning up felt like a form of death. Either it was acting, or there was nothing at all. Consequently, he found himself back on this porch each and every morning, performing the same actions for the same reason. As he went through the classified section of the newspaper, he would slowly flip through it, his eyes searching for the words that would change everything: open call or auditions. While he was walking down a column of very small type on this particular morning, his gaze was drawn to something that caught his interest. It was a commercial that did not appear to be proper. The production of the musical was taking place in Ohio, which was several hundred miles away from where it was being used. From the beginning, Luther was only perplexed. There is no need for a theater company in Ohio to advertise for performers in a newspaper in St. Louis when they are located in Indiana. It was very confusing to me. As he read the text in further detail, however, he felt a surge of electricity go through his physique. In the advertisement, it was said that the producers were looking for a very specific type of actor to play a character that was described as being highly different and difficult to play. It was not an error. Rather, the advertisement was a targeted search. Additionally, as Luther read the particular criterion, he experienced a peculiar feeling of assurance that washed over him. There was more to him than merely a wonderful fit for this role. He embodied the ideal candidate. He was thinking that this might be the final solution. It's possible that this will be for him. However, he was well aware that this would not be a simple task. It was a very difficult challenge. To begin, there was the great distance between them. It was that exact night that the audition was scheduled, which meant that he would have to abandon everything, hop into his car, and drive for the entire day in order to have a brief opportunity to perform on a stage in Ohio. This brings us to the second and most significant point: the character themselves. If he wanted to provide a performance that the producers would never forget, he would have to do something drastic in order to properly embrace this part on the big screen. Considering the level of dedication that would be required, the majority of actors would not even contemplate it. Luther, however, was not like other actors. Once he had been informed that he was not good enough for 5 years, he was determined to do everything in order to prove his point. Desperation had been building up for such a long time that it had now reached a point where it had boiled over into a kind of reckless determination. Despite the fact that he was still holding the newspaper tightly in his hand, he got up from the porch and made his way back into the home. He then proceeded to stroll out to his vehicle a few minutes later. Over the course of his lengthy voyage, he was transporting 3 items with him. When he arrived at the theater in Ohio, he was accompanied by a map. In order to give him the bravery he would require, he had a whole bottle of whiskey in his possession. In addition to that, he was armed with a hacksaw to assist him in his role. During that particular evening in Ohio, a producer for the musical was seen sitting in a seat that was facing the front row of an auditorium that was otherwise empty. There were long shadows cast all across the room by the stage lights. She was really worn out. There had been a procession of hopeful actors coming and going for a number of hours, each one attempting to impress her by reading monologues, singing songs, and performing. In spite of the fact that she was aware that there was still a queue of people waiting outside in the corridor, she moaned and rubbed her temples. For the next person to enter, she yelled out for them to do so. Just a few moments later, a man made his way onto the stage by stumbling through the side curtain. The expression on the producer's face changed from one of exhaustion to one of confusion as she sat up a bit upright. As if he were intoxicated, the man was wobbly on his feet and swayed slightly from side to side. Additionally, he was dressed in a peculiar attire. He had thick, white bandages wrapped securely over his head, covering his ears and the most of his face. Both of his ears were covered. In a slurred and thick voice, he proclaimed that his name was Luther Charles. He staggered to the center of the platform, blinked into the lights, and then announced his name. He claimed that he had traveled all the way from Missouri to be considered for the role because he was aware that they were searching for a very certain type of actor, and he had made certain that he was an ideal candidate for the role. The producer was completely clueless about the subject he was discussing. She tried to urge him to clarify, to explain what he meant, but before she could get the words out, Luther began to lift his hands up to his head. She found herself unable to finish her sentence. Unwrapping the bandages was something he did in a methodical and slow manner. He yanked at the white gauze, allowing it to fall onto the stage floor in a jumbled mass due to his actions. As she watched, the producer felt a mounting sense of dread building up in her gut. It was only when the final bandage was removed, exposing the contents of the wound, that she was able to see it. Moreover, she started yelling for assistance. It would come out that the casting call that had been published in the newspaper, the one that had given Luther Charles such a powerful sense of hope, contained an error that was extremely terrible and devastating. Those who were in charge of producing the musical were looking for actors who were not just honest, but also courageous. But the advertisement that had been published in the newspaper in St. Louis contained a call for, quote, genuine earless actors. Luther Charles, who had been so consumed by his desire and so broken by 5 years of rejection, had come to the conclusion that this was his one and only chance. After driving all the way to Ohio, he had consumed a whole bottle of whiskey in an attempt to dull the pain. After that, he had committed a heinous act of self-mutilation by cutting off both of his own ears with a hacksaw. He was convinced that by making this sacrifice, he would be able to fulfill the role perfectly. Luther made it through the injuries he inflicted on himself. He received significant psychological care after being brought to the hospital, where he remained for some time. Nevertheless, he was not selected for the role. In the evening of October 2003, a woman named Tina was walking down the lengthy and narrow hallway of her apartment building in Harlem, New York. She was in the process of making her way down the corridor. While walking cautiously on the worn linoleum floor, she carried a grocery bag in one hand and moved with some caution. The walls were covered in pristine white tile, and the huge metal doors of the flats stood like sentinels on either side of the walls. The corridor was illuminated with a peculiar, pulsating glow as the fluorescent lights that were hanging above flickered in an irregular manner. Tina was confronted with a fragrance that was both recognizable and repulsive as she came to a stop in front of her own door, which resided in apartment 5D. It was coming from apartment 5E, which was right across the hall from where it arrived. It had a heavy, smelly odor that was a combination of rotting flesh and pee that had been around for a long time. Tina's expression changed to one of disdain. The only thing she wanted more than anything was to get inside her own apartment and get away from the odor. She hastily put her grocery bag down and began searching through her purse for her keys. The sound of footfall approaching from down the corridor came to her attention just as her fingers were about to close over the cool metal of her keys. As soon as she turned around, a surge of worry swept through her. Antoine Yates, the individual who resided in apartment 5E, was the person responsible for the foul odor, as it was known. As he approached her, he was carrying a large bag that appeared to be quite heavy over his shoulder. He was going directly toward her. On the surface, it appeared as though it might be filled with sand or possibly gravel. It was something that Tina had no idea what it was, and she had no desire to find out. Simply put, she was aware that she did not wish to be in any way close to him. The door was thrown open by her clumsy hands as she smashed her key into the lock, turned it, and then threw it open. To the point that she virtually dove inside, she grabbed her grocery bag from the floor, slammed the door shut behind her, and instantly threw the deadbolt. Because she had been so plainly impolite, she felt a rush of shame wash over her. Finally, Antoine had been her neighbor for a considerable amount of time. A period of time had passed when she had the impression that he was a completely decent and typical guy. However, as of late, he has undergone a shift in some aspect. He had developed an odd and peculiar demeanor, and his actions were causing her to feel extremely uneasy. The odor, which appeared to emanate from his apartment at all hours of the day and night, was the initial cause of the problem. Another factor to consider was the fact that he had turned into a complete recluse. Tina was unable to recall the last time she had saw him leave the premises for a period of time that was more than an hour all at once. There was a steady, unseen presence just a few feet away from her own front door, and it was as if he was holed up in there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. On the other hand, the noise was the most unnerving aspect. Tina would hear heavy crashing and thumping sounds coming from Antoine's flat at irregular intervals, whether it was during the day or the night. The sound was similar to that of furniture being thrown around, but as far as she could tell, he never had any guests inside his home. There was only him inside the room. Despite the fact that Tina was unaware of what he was doing, she was beginning to get the impression that whatever it was not a nice thing. Despite this, she assured herself that it was none of her business. All she could do was keep to herself, make sure that her door was always locked, and keep her fingers crossed that whatever bizarre phase Antoine was going through would ultimately pass. This was the best thing she could do. Following a couple of days, Tina made her way down to the lobby in order to retrieve her mail. During the process of organizing her letters, she came across a woman named Joyce. Joyce was a resident of apartment 4E, which was the flat that was just below Antoine's. After a brief greeting, Joyce approached Tina with a worried expression on her face and walked over to her. Tina had the ability to sense that something was awry, so she inquired about the situation. In her explanation, Joyce mentioned that she had observed liquid dripping from her ceiling the night before yesterday. Her initial assumption was that it was nothing more than a leaking pipe or even a sink from the apartment above that was overflowing. On the other hand, she discovered that it was not water when she brought a cloth to wipe it up. A powerful and pungent odor emanated from the liquid. A scent of urine was present. Joyce then softened her voice and moved closer to Tina, bringing her closer to her. She stated that the pouring was not the only peculiar thing that occurred. She went on to say that she was able to hear sounds emanating from Antoine's flat on occasion, particularly in the late hours of the night when the building was entirely silent. Not a single crash or bang could be heard. It was almost like a whimpering sound. As soon as she heard that, Tina's heart began to race. She had exerted a great deal of effort to disregard the circumstance and to simply blank it out. However, now that she was aware that another neighbor was also going through strange and unsettling occurrences, she felt as though she could no longer maintain her silence. Something more than simply an odd odor was going on here. Tina made a suggestion to Joyce that they should initiate a call to the housing authority in order to have someone come out and investigate the situation that was occurring in apartment 5E. For her part, Joyce simply shook her head. She stated that she had already attempted that at least a few times. Despite the fact that she had contacted and voiced her displeasure, there had been no action taken as of yet. A new strategy was then suggested by Tina. It is recommended that they get together with all of the other neighbors who are worried and go to the housing authority as a group. It would be impossible to disregard the complaints of a significant number of tenants, wouldn't it? I concur with Joyce that it was a good idea. Following the exchange of phone numbers between the two women, Tina made her way back to her flat, feeling a little more optimistic about the situation. The very following day, however, Tina arrived into the lobby of her building and was greeted with a scene of commotion. This occurred before she had the opportunity to speak with anyone else during the day. Unable to contain his misery, Antoine was lying on the ground. In an effort to maintain control of the situation, 2 law enforcement personnel were crouching over him. Blood was spread all over the tile floor, and Antoine had inflicted significant cuts on both his arm and his leg. The wounds were gaping and deep. Tina halted for a while, unsure about what to do, and then swiftly hurried away from the scene, indicating that she did not wish to become involved. Upstairs, she hurriedly went to her apartment and locked the door behind her. However, she was unable to contain her interest. She made a beeline for her window, which looked out onto the street, in the hopes of gaining some insight into the unexpected events that had just taken place. I watched an ambulance pull up to the curb, and she noticed it. There were a few moments later when paramedics exited from the building while pushing a stretcher that included Antoine on it. They loaded him into the back of the ambulance, and then their sirens began to sound as they rushed away. Tina watched, hoping that she would hear the police officers coming down her corridor to smash down the door of apartment 5E at any moment. She was awaiting them with great anticipation. Clearly, a violent incident had taken place, and the flat in question had to be the location of the perpetrator. She, however, waited. She waited for an hour, but she did not hear anything. The corridor remained devoid of sound. Then she peeked out her window once more and observed the 2 police officers who were stationed in the lobby walk out of the building, get into their squad vehicle, and then simply drive away. It was a shock to Tina. She was unable to comprehend all of it. There is no way that Antoine could have ever told them something that would have caused them to depart without even checking out his place. A growing sense of panic began to envelop her. What would happen if someone was harmed inside then? Imagine for a moment that Antoine had been assaulting someone and that they had finally started fighting back. Regardless of what was taking place, it was made abundantly obvious that it would never cease unless another individual raised their voice. She was aware of what she needed to do, despite the fact that it terrified her. She obtained her phone, contacted 911, and provided the dispatcher with all of the information that she was aware of regarding her neighbor who lived in Unit 5E. Tina arrived home from work the following day to discover a large crowd assembled on the pavement in front of her building. There were hundreds of people standing there, and each and every one of them was looking up at the opposite side of the structure. Tina's jaw fell as she followed their eyes and looked at them. From the roof of the building, a law enforcement officer was rappelling down the side of the structure. As he stood there, he was armed with a huge weapon and dressed in combat gear. He went slowly and cautiously, making his way down until he came to a stop, hung in the air right outside a window on the 5th level. Tina was taken aback when she became aware that he was standing at Antoine's window. The gathering remained silent as the officer began to tap on the glass, and they watched in reverent curiosity. Instantaneously, the window shattered outwards, causing pieces of glass to fall down onto the street below. Internally, it had been shattered into pieces. Instantaneously, the cop raised his firearm and fired a number of shots into the flat. Concurrently, he gave a signal to the officers who were stationed on the roof, and they immediately started dragging him up and away from the window. After a few minutes had passed, the front doors of the building suddenly opened, and a half-dozen additional officers came sprinting out of the building. It was a massive and heavy tarp that they were carrying between them, and whatever was contained within it was an enormous and struggling object. Tina was very perplexed by everything that was going on until the officers passed the tarp by her. Only for a fraction of a second did she get a peek of what was contained within. It would come out that Tina and Joyce were correct in their suspicions of Antoine. Nevertheless, the reality was much more peculiar than they could have ever imagined it to be. It is not true that Antoine was a violent criminal who caused harm to individuals in his residence. Despite the fact that he was concealing a secret, it was a rather peculiar one. He had a pet of his own, a Bengal tiger named Ming that weighs 400 pounds. For a considerable amount of time, the tiger had been residing within that modest apartment in Harlem. A massive heap of sand served as its bed in one of the bedrooms of the house. It urinated all over the flat, which resulted in the odor and the leaking that Joyce had observed. Antoine also provided it with a food consisting of raw meat, which he would bring back to his house in those enormous sacks. The terrible wounds that Antoine sustained and that required him to go to the hospital were caused by Ming. It had just lately come to Antoine's attention that he had taken in a stray kitten. When the tiger attempted to attack on the much smaller cat, Antoine had intervened and ended up getting bitten in the process. It was Antoine and Ming who made it through the confrontation alive. After being taken into custody, Antoine was found guilty of reckless endangerment. After the officer on the rope had administered a tranquilizer dart to Ming, he was hauled out of the premises and subsequently transported to an animal refuge in Ohio. Ming had been hit with the dart. Furthermore, it is remarkable that the stray kitten managed to survive the attack as well. On the 6th of January, 1995, at 2:45 in the afternoon, a man called MacArthur Wheeler, who was 45 years old at the time, proceeded with intent toward the glass front doors of a bank located in Swissvale, Pennsylvania, which is a tiny town located just outside of Pittsburgh. In spite of the fact that the temperature was rather mild, he was dressed in a large blue parka and wore a simple mask that was pulled over his face. However, the mask did not completely cover his entire face. Although it was concealed within one of his pockets, his hand was resting on the icy steel of a revolver that was semi-automatic. It was about to be MacArthur's turn to rob this bank. On the other hand, there was a peculiar sense of peace that he experienced as he approached the door. Not in the least bit anxious was he. It came as a surprise to everyone, especially considering that MacArthur had never done anything remotely like to this in his entire life. But he was not by himself. The individual that was already inside was his acquaintance, a man named Clifton Johnson, who was 43 years old. Clifton had participated in a bank robbery in the past, and he was the one who had recruited MacArthur to participate in this scheme. At this very moment, Clifton was waiting in line, acting as if he were just another client. However, in reality, he was acting as MacArthur's sidekick and lookout. In order to carry out this heist, the two men had spent several days carefully arranging every aspect of it. They were familiar with the layout of the bank, had timed the flow of customers, and had practiced each and every move they were going to make. Clifton exuded an air of serenity and self-assurance, in contrast to MacArthur, who had initially been filled with fear at the prospect. MacArthur had been taken through every conceivable scenario that could have gone wrong, and he had devised a backup plan for each and every one of each of those scenarios. The self-assurance that Clifton exuded had already made its way into MacArthur by the time this day arrived. At this point, he was very positive that their strategy was devoid of any possibility of failure and that they were going to be able to get away with it. For this reason, he did not feel anxious. Upon approaching the doors of the bank, he forced them open and proceeded to enter the establishment. Although he had to squint a little bit since his mask hindered his eyesight a little bit, he was able to locate Clifton standing in line very quickly, which was exactly what they had planned. Another boost of self-assurance came to MacArthur when he observed him in that location. Without a hitch, everything was operating. As he strolled past the queue of clients who were waiting, he went straight to the teller window that was open and made eye contact with the young woman who was working behind the counter. The revolver was pulled out of his pocket while he continued to do so. He gently instructed her to pay up all of the money while directing it directly at her to be handed over. The other individuals in the bank let out a collective gasp, which he heard them all say. As soon as they had a glimpse of what was taking place, customers and other personnel were rendered speechless, their eyes widened in terror. After a moment, MacArthur turned around and raised the rifle so that everyone could see it. He assured them that he had no intention of causing harm to anyone. Just to be calm, that was all he asked of them. As soon as he obtained the funds, he would go without a trace. Next, he refocused his attention on the teller. By this point, she had quickly retrieved all of the cash from her drawer and was in the process of holding it out with a hand that was shaking. The bundle of cash was taken by MacArthur, who then placed it into his pocket and put his revolver away somewhere else. He cast a quick glance in the direction of Clifton, who was on his way to the entrance. Both males established eye contact with one another and gave each other a slight nod. The two of them then made a U-turn and fled the bank, disappearing down the street immediately after. Roughly 3 months had passed on. The early morning hours of the 20th of April, 1995, saw MacArthur sound asleep in his apartment located just outside of Pittsburgh. He had been there for quite some time. He and Clifton had taken their booty, which was a little more than $5,000, and had promptly gone their separate ways after the robbery had been completed. The goal was to keep a low profile, stop making touch with one another, and wait for things to calm down. Everything had gone according to plan as far as MacArthur was concerned, and everything had worked out perfectly. Even though 3 months had passed, he was still a free man, and he was enjoying his portion of the money that had been taken. He had never been approached by the police, nor had they ever attempted to question him in any way. There was no danger to him. On the other hand, on this particular night, his restful sleep was disrupted by a loud and persistent beating on his front door. While he was lying in bed, he suddenly became upright as a voice called for him to open his eyes and announced that it was the cops. A surge of genuine panic came over MacArthur for the very first time since the heist had taken place. Nevertheless, he promptly made an effort to settle himself down. The advice he gave himself was to just keep his cool. Even in the event that the police believed he was involved in some manner, there was no way that they could prove anything. Their plan had been flawless all along. A mask and a massive parka that totally covered him had been worn by him at the time. His identity was safely protected. After that, MacArthur got out of bed, strolled to the door, and opened it. He took a deep breath before doing so. In the corridor, there were a number of law enforcement officers standing. The question was posed by MacArthur, who put on his most bewildered appearance and inquired about the situation. When he was notified that he was being arrested for armed robbery, one of the cops informed him of the situation. The officer then displayed a photograph to the public. The image was a still one, and it had been printed from one of the security cameras at the bank. And MacArthur's face was seen in the photograph, as plain as the sun. It was possible to make out every nuance of his appearance, from his eyes to his nose to his mouth. It could not have been anyone else but him. In point of fact, it did not appear in any way that he was wearing a mask throughout the entire photo. Despite his mind's inability to comprehend what he was seeing, MacArthur continued to stare at the photograph. This was not to be expected. His expression was a mixture of amazement and bewilderment as he looked up from the photo to the faces of the cops serving the law. Afterwards, he uttered a remark that would leave the police absolutely perplexed when they heard it. "Just now," he articulated, "but I wore the juice." In the course of the bank heist, it would be discovered that the mask that MacArthur Wheeler was wearing was not a ski mask, a Halloween mask, or any other form of mask in the conventional sense. What can only be characterized as a breathtaking leap of erroneous logic, MacArthur and his accomplice Clifton had come to believe that they had discovered a hidden way to turn invisible. This is something that can only be described as outrageous. The thing that they had done and what they sincerely believed would fully conceal their identity from the surveillance cameras was to put lemon juice all over their faces. As a matter of fact, they were under the notion that the acidic juice would function as a kind of invisibility cloak, rendering their faces hazy or completely invisible to electronic surveillance. Lemon juice does not, contrary to what they believe, possess the ability to render you invisible. Upon reviewing the CCTV footage of the bank, the police were presented with a high-definition, crystal-clear view of MacArthur Wheeler and Clifton Johnson committing the theft of the bank. The fact that there was such abundant evidence meant that it was just a matter of time before they were recognized and taken into custody. The role that Clifton Johnson played in the armed robbery resulted in him receiving a sentence of 5 years in jail. MacArthur Wheeler was given a sentence that was significantly more severe, which was 22.5 years. On the other hand, this odd and almost comical crime did not completely end there. In the end, a professor of social psychology at Cornell University became interested in the story of the lemon juice bandits when it was reported in the media and eventually drew his attention. After reading about the case, the professor was struck by something that had a deep impact on him. A level of stupidity that was almost impossible to grasp was suggested by the fact that MacArthur Wheeler sincerely believed that lemon juice would render him invisible, and that he was so certain of this view that he used it as a basis for betting his freedom on it. Even more remarkable, however, was MacArthur's reaction of surprise when he was discovered. The fact that he was confused gave the impression that he was not only incompetent, but that he was also totally oblivious to the fact that he was failing. The professor's interest was piqued by this thought, and he accordingly started conducting research on the topic. This research finally resulted in the development of a well-known psychological theory that is now commonly referred to as the Dunning-Kruger effect. In essence, the effect argues that individuals who have a low capacity to perform a task have a tendency to exaggerate their own abilities. In more straightforward terms, the more terrible a person is at something, the less likely it is that they will acknowledge how incompetent they are at that particular item. At the end of the day, it's true that the more ignorant you are, the more self-assured you become. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time, what's up? In 2003, a man named Kevin Mannis was the owner of a small antique shop. It was nestled right in downtown Portland, Oregon, sitting near the base of the Burnside Bridge, a spot many considered the main gateway into the city. Because Kevin was in the antique business, his life revolved around finding hidden treasures. He was a regular at yard sales, flea markets, and especially estate sales, always on the lookout for that next unique item he could clean up and sell in his shop. One day, he heard about an estate sale happening at the home of a woman who had recently passed away. She was 103 years old, a Holocaust survivor, and her entire life's collection of possessions was being sold off. Kevin drove over to the house, and when he got there, he saw how they were organizing the sale. Instead of selling items one by one, the organizers had bundled everything into different lots. If you wanted one specific thing, you had to bid on the entire lot it was in. Kevin browsed around, his eyes scanning the various collections of furniture, dishware, and old tools. His attention was eventually caught by one particular bundle designated as Lot 29. Inside this lot were a couple of small, interesting tools that he knew he could easily sell, but there was something else in there too. It was a wooden box, and it had a simple label on it that just said, "Mystery Box." He was intrigued. He didn't know why, but he felt drawn to it. So, he placed a bid on Lot 29, and after a little back and forth with other bidders, he won. He was genuinely pleased with his purchase. He gathered up the contents of Lot 29 and began wheeling them over to his car. As he was carefully loading the items into his trunk, a voice from behind him suddenly spoke up. "Oh," the person said, "so you went with the Dybbuk box, huh?" The word Dybbuk sent an immediate jolt through Kevin. It took him straight back to his childhood. Kevin was Jewish, and growing up, his parents and grandparents would tell him stories about the Dybbuk, a malevolent, wandering spirit from Jewish folklore that could possess the living. They'd often use it as a way to get him to behave. They'd say things like, "You better not do that, Kevin, or the Dybbuk's going to get you." As a little kid, he had been absolutely terrified of these stories. So, hearing this stranger use that word, his curiosity was immediately piqued. He turned around to see a woman standing there, one of the family members from the estate sale. He looked at her and asked, "Did you just call this box a Dybbuk box?" The woman nodded. "Yeah," she said. "My grandmother was terrified of it. She always said no one could ever open it." Kevin's eyes went back to the box. It was about 2 feet high and a foot wide, a sort of small wine cabinet. It had 2 little doors on the front that swung open and a drawer at the bottom. A single lock sat across the 2 doors, currently held shut by a small, simple padlock. He looked back up at the woman. "Why can't you open it?" he asked. The woman just shrugged. "We never knew for sure," she explained. "But our grandmother would get this look on her face, this look of real fear, every time we even said the word Dybbuk. It was weird enough that we just learned not to ask any questions. We all just stayed away from her Dybbuk box." Kevin agreed that it was definitely a weird story. He finished loading his car, shut the trunk, said a quick goodbye to the woman, and then got in his car to drive away. At that moment, he wasn't really thinking the box was anything sinister. He figured it was just some random chest that a family had built a strange story around. He drove back to his antique shop and started the process of unloading all the things he'd bought at the auction. He brought the items inside one by one and carried them downstairs to the basement. The main floor of his shop was the showroom, where everything was polished and displayed for customers. The basement, on the other hand, was his workshop and warehouse. It was a much bigger space, filled with long rows of industrial shelving and a large workstation where he would clean, repair, and price his new acquisitions before bringing them upstairs. He carried the Dybbuk box down and set it on a back table. His plan was to just leave it there for a while and go back upstairs to open the shop for the day. But as he turned to leave, he suddenly felt a very strong wave of curiosity. He found himself really wanting to open the box. He walked back over to it and gave a little tug on the front doors. He didn't want to damage the wood, but he could tell the padlock was relatively new and wasn't going to just pop off. He didn't have the key, and he didn't have any bolt cutters handy. So he grabbed a screwdriver from his workbench. He carefully wedged the tip of it underneath the metal hasp that was screwed into the wood of the door. He slowly and gently pried it upwards, bending the metal until the screws popped out of the wood. As soon as the hasp was free, the 2 doors swung open on their own. And at the exact same moment, the drawer on the bottom slid open. There was some kind of simple mechanical device inside that linked the doors to the drawer. Kevin remembered thinking how surprisingly clever it was for such an old, crummy-looking wine cabinet to have a mechanism like that still in perfect working order. He peered inside. The contents were strange, but not exactly scary. There were 2 pennies from the 1920s, a single used candle, 2 small locks of human hair tied with string, a small granite tombstone carving that had the word Shalom engraved on it, and a small, tarnished wine goblet. That was it. Kevin looked at the collection of items and immediately thought to himself that this was just some older woman's personal keepsake box. These things probably had immense sentimental value to her, but to him, they were basically worthless. He shut the doors, pushed the box to the side of the desk, and walked back upstairs, not giving it another thought. Kevin had one employee who helped him run the shop. Her name was Jane. She was a younger woman, but she was an incredible salesperson, and Kevin trusted her completely. The day after he had brought the Dybbuk box into the shop and left it in the basement, Kevin had to run out to do some errands. He left Jane in charge of the store. After Kevin left, Jane locked the front door behind him. It was still before their official opening time, and she needed to go downstairs to grab a few items she wanted to bring up to the main floor to sell that day. With the front door locked, she knew for a fact that she was the only person inside the entire building. She walked to the back and headed down the old wooden steps into the basement. The basement was a huge, sprawling room filled with tall industrial shelves that ran the entire length of the space. The lighting down there was never very good. It came from a few long fluorescent tube lights that, even at their best, only cast a subtle, weak yellow glow on everything. They weren't very bright, and changing the bulbs was a real pain. You had to set up a ladder between the aisles, but the lights weren't perfectly aligned, so you always had to reach way over the shelving, risking knocking over fragile, expensive antiques. Because of this, Kevin and Jane often waited until they were down to just one or two flickering, dying lights before they finally admitted they had to go up there and replace some of the bulbs. On this particular day, they were down to about 2 or 3 working lights, so the basement was even dimmer and gloomier than usual. It felt like something out of a horror movie, Jane walking alone into this dingy, poorly lit space. Once she reached the bottom of the stairs, she walked to the far end of the room, to a corner a good distance away from the back table where Kevin had left the Dybbuk box. She was looking for some specific items on a shelf when, all of a sudden, she stopped. She couldn't shake the distinct and unsettling feeling that someone was watching her. Now, Jane was down in this basement all the time. She had been down there when it was well lit and when it was dark, when Kevin was with her and when she was alone. This was a familiar space for her, and she had never, not once, had this feeling before. There was no other way into the basement except for the stairs she had just come down. She had locked the front door of the shop herself. She hadn't heard a single sound. There was no logical explanation for where this feeling was coming from, but it was powerful and she couldn't shake it. As she stood there, looking around nervously, starting to feel a bit paranoid, the phone rang. They had an old landline phone on a table right at the base of the stairs. The sudden, loud ringing made her jump, and it kind of snapped her back to reality. She thought to herself, okay, I'm just getting paranoid. She walked over and picked up the phone. It was one of her friends who was planning on stopping by the shop later that day. As they were chatting, Jane heard a noise from the back of the basement. It sounded like a broom falling over. Imagine a big push broom leaning against a concrete wall, and then it slips and the long wooden handle clatters against the floor. That's the exact sound she heard. It startled her again. She quickly said to her friend, "Hey, let me call you right back," and hung up the phone. She stood at the foot of the stairs, looking down the long, dark aisles of shelving. The sound had come from the far side of the room, back where she had just been. Because the lighting was so terrible, she couldn't see anything clearly. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves, and began walking slowly down one of the rows to see what had fallen over. As she was walking, she heard a loud smash from behind her. She spun around just in time to see that one of the long fluorescent tube lights had fallen from the ceiling and shattered all over the concrete floor, plunging that section of the basement into even deeper darkness. All of a sudden, she had zero interest in exploring the sound of the fallen broom. All she wanted was to get out of there. She turned and started walking quickly back towards the stairs. As she was moving down one of the aisles, a heavy wooden chair that had been sitting on one of the shelves suddenly came flying off of it. It landed squarely in the middle of the path, blocking her way. There was absolutely no way this could have happened on its own. It was a sturdy chair, placed securely on the shelf. It was as if someone had deliberately pushed it. In that instant, she knew her initial feeling was right. Someone else was down here with her. She let out a scream, hurtled over the fallen chair, and sprinted for the stairs. She ran up the steps as fast as she could, but when she got to the top, her heart sank. There was a heavy metal gate that they used to lock up the basement at night for extra security. It was pulled shut and padlocked. This gate could only be locked from the outside, and it required a key. There was no way she could have done this by accident. Now, she was in a full-blown panic. She was trapped in the basement with some unknown person who was throwing things around and breaking lights. She grabbed the bars of the gate and started shaking it with all her strength, yelling for Kevin. She thought maybe he had come back, somehow didn't realize she was downstairs, and had locked the gate as a joke or by mistake. As she yelled, she kept looking over her shoulder down into the dark basement. She could hear more sounds now, more lights falling from the ceiling and shattering on the floor. She was in absolute terror, just waiting for someone to come bounding up the stairs after her. She had no idea what to do. She fumbled for her phone in her pocket and frantically dialed Kevin's number. Meanwhile, Kevin was just making his way back to the antique shop. He was only a couple of minutes away. He saw his phone, which was sitting on the passenger seat, light up and start ringing. He picked it up and saw it was Jane. He answered and was immediately met with Jane's hysterical voice. She was screaming that someone was in the shop, that they were breaking things. Kevin tried to calm her down, saying, slow down, what's going on? All he could hear in the background was the distinct and chaotic sound of glass shattering and other heavy things falling and breaking. He said, wait, what's happening? Are you okay, Jane? Where are you? He heard her yell back, someone's in the basement. He immediately told her, where are you? And she screamed, I'm in the basement. His heart dropped. Get out of the basement, he yelled. Call the police! But as he was trying to tell her what to do, the phone line went dead. Kevin was only about a block away from his shop at this point. He floored it. He sped to the shop and parked haphazardly outside. His mind was racing. What was he about to walk into? Was there an active burglary happening? Was Jane being held hostage? Were the police already there? All he knew was that he had to get inside to help Jane. He ran to the front door and found it was still locked. He fumbled with his keys, unlocked the door, and burst inside. The shop was silent. He looked around the main floor. There was no damage, nothing was out of place. He yelled out for Jane, but there was no answer. He started walking tentatively through the store, heading towards the back where the door to the basement was. He got to the metal gate at the top of the stairs, the same one Jane had found locked. He looked at it, and it was still shut and padlocked. Jane was nowhere to be seen on the main floor. He was confused. He thought, I didn't lock that door. I'm the only one with a key for that lock. How is it locked right now? Does Jane have a key I don't know about? Why would she lock it? Does that mean she's up here somewhere? He called out again, Jane, come out! Did you lock this door? But the first floor was very small and it was clear she wasn't there. He realized she had to still be downstairs. So he took out his key, unlocked the gate, and swung it open. He started walking down the steps, moving very cautiously because he still had no idea what he was walking into. He flicked the light switch, but the lights in the basement didn't turn on. As he rounded the bottom of the stairs, where he could finally see into the main part of the basement, he saw Jane. She was sitting in a chair right next to the table where the phone was. She was just sitting there, completely still, with a stunned, blank expression on her face. He rushed over to her. Jane, he said, what happened down here? He glanced out at the rows of shelves and saw the mess. Furniture was knocked over, and there was broken glass from the light fixtures all over the floor. He looked back at Jane, but she was showing no reaction at all. She just looked like she was in shock. He tried again. Come on, you have to tell me what happened down here. Jane finally looked at him and spoke in a quiet voice. I don't know, she said. I don't know how to explain what happened. I was just walking down the row, and then I felt like someone was watching me. And then things started falling off the ceiling and off the shelves. I've never seen anything like it before. At this point, Kevin's own adrenaline was pumping. He had come charging in, thinking he was going to have to save Jane from an intruder. But as far as he could tell, there was no one else there. It was just Jane. He decided he needed to search the basement himself. He grabbed a heavy flashlight and started walking methodically up and down the aisles. All he found was a bunch of broken glass and some furniture and other items that had been knocked off the shelves. But there was no one else down there. And there was no other way in or out besides the stairs. After he was absolutely certain that they were alone, Kevin turned back to Jane. He said in later interviews that he feels horrible about what he did next, but at the time, his mind was trying to find a logical explanation. He was thinking, it had to have been Jane. Who else could have done this? I don't know why she would do it, but there's no one else here. He looked at her and said, Jane, did you do this? That's when Jane's shock finally broke. It was replaced by pure anger. She looked at him with disbelief and just said, F you, Kevin. And with that, she got up, walked past him, went up the stairs, and left. She didn't say another word to him, and she never came back to work. She quit on the spot. At the time, Kevin still believed she must have been responsible, so he just let her go. He wasn't even remotely considering that the Dybbuk box on the back table could have had anything to do with it. Just a couple of days after the incident in the basement, Kevin's mother was scheduled to stop by the antique shop. The two of them had plans to go out for lunch together to celebrate her birthday. As soon as she walked into the shop, Kevin greeted her with a smile. Hey, Mom, I've got a gift for you, he said. He brought over a wrapped box and set it down on a table right in front of his mother, who was sitting in a chair. He unwrapped it to reveal the Dybbuk box. Before Kevin could even begin to explain the strange story behind it, the phone at the other end of the store started ringing. He was expecting an important call. He said, Hold on, Mom, I have to get this. He walked to the back of the store to answer the phone, leaving his mother sitting there alone, looking at the box. While Kevin was on the phone, his mother, intrigued by the unusual gift, reached out and opened the doors of the Dybbuk box. She would later say that as soon as she opened it, she was hit with an unbelievable and overwhelming sense of dread. She felt like she had to sit down. She just stared at the contents of the box, feeling like she couldn't look away. And then, all of a sudden, she suffered a massive stroke. She keeled over in her chair, unable to move, unable to talk. Kevin saw what was happening from across the room. He slammed the phone down and ran over to her, yelling, Mom! What's going on? He immediately called 911. As the paramedics were working on her, she would later recall that while she was in that paralyzed state, unable to speak or move, the only thing she wanted to communicate was that her son had to get rid of that box. She didn't know why, but she had an absolute certainty that the box was somehow responsible for her stroke. The only thing she could control was the movement of her eyes. So, as her son stood beside her, filled with panic, she found herself looking at the Dybbuk box, then looking away. Looking at the box, then looking away. She was desperately hoping that he would see her eyes, understand it was a signal, and make the connection that the box was a bad thing. Kevin did notice his mom flicking her eyes towards the Dybbuk box, but in the heat of the moment, he was far more concerned about her health. It wasn't until much later that day, after she had been taken to the hospital and he knew she was stable and going to be okay, that he replayed the scene in his head. He remembered the look of pure terror in his mom's eyes, and he realized she had been looking at the Dybbuk box as if it was the source of her fear, not the stroke itself. That's when Kevin started to think that something was seriously wrong with this box. Either it was an object of incredibly bad luck, or there was some truth to the old woman's warning that you should never, ever open it. Either way, he didn't want to take any more chances. Since he had brought this thing into his life, his best employee had a terrifying breakdown in his basement, and now his mother had suffered a stroke right in front of it. He decided he had to get rid of it. Kevin put the Dybbuk box at the very front of his antique store and put a price tag on it. Very quickly, a young couple came into the store, saw it, and bought it. Kevin felt a huge wave of relief. He thought, thank goodness, that bad luck charm, whatever's going on with that thing, is finally gone and out of my life. But just a couple of days later, he was working in the back of the shop when he heard the front door open and then shut. He walked out to the main floor expecting to see a customer, but instead, he saw the Dybbuk box sitting on the floor right inside the entrance. Someone must have just dropped it off and left. He walked up to it and saw a piece of paper had been taped to the top. There was writing on it. All it said was, "This has an odd darkness about it." This really freaked Kevin out. It was one thing for him to have his own strange experiences, but now it was like other people were independently confirming that something was deeply wrong with this box. Kevin did not want the Dybbuk box in his store for another second. He carried it out to his car, drove it back to his house, and put it in his personal storage locker. He locked it up tight and then went back to work for the rest of the day. That night, when he went home, he went to bed and had the most vivid and terrifying dream of his life. In the dream, he was walking through a beautiful, sunny courtyard. He was holding the hand of a woman who he knew was his friend. He felt safe and trusted this person completely. It was a very positive, happy dream. But as they were walking, the woman suddenly started to pull away from him. He felt his feet become anchored to the ground. He couldn't move. He was losing his grip on her hand as she kept moving further and further away until finally her hand slipped out of his and she disappeared into a corner of the courtyard that was shrouded in total darkness. He stood there, unable to move, just staring into the darkness, waiting for his friend to come back out. As he was looking, he saw the figure of an old woman slowly walking out of the shadows. Her head was down, and she was a good distance away. She just kept walking closer and closer to him. When she was about 5 or 6 feet away, she slowly raised her head. Her entire face was rotting. The skin was literally falling off her skull like she was a walking corpse. She raised her gnarled hands up in front of her, and then she lunged at him. She grabbed his face and began pulling off pieces of his skin until he suddenly woke up, screaming. Kevin had to sit up in bed for a long time just to compose himself. He was so shaken from the dream. He eventually got up and went into the bathroom to get a drink of water. As he walked past the mirror, he glanced at his reflection and noticed something strange. There were dark marks on his shoulders and arms that he knew were not there before he went to sleep. They looked like deep, fresh bruises. He stared at them thinking, "No way. That has nothing to do with the dream. It's just a coincidence that the woman in the dream was grabbing me in these exact spots." He tried to write it off and went back to bed. But as soon as he fell asleep, he had the exact same dream again. He woke up a second time, breathing heavily, covered in a cold sweat from the same terrifying nightmare. He went back into the bathroom, and what he saw this time made his stomach turn. His entire back was now covered in bruises. He had bruises all over his back, all over his arms, and there were fresh red marks on his neck. Now, there was no doubt in his mind. He felt it had to be the Dybbuk box. The box was in his storage unit just outside, and it couldn't be a coincidence that he was suddenly having these horrific, physically manifesting nightmares. Kevin was done. He was completely done with the Dybbuk box. Instead of going back to bed, he went straight to his computer, logged onto eBay, and listed the Dybbuk box for sale. That very night, 2 college kids named Sam and Brian, who lived in Missouri, bought it. Kevin could not have been happier to package that thing up and ship it as far away from him as possible. Sam and Brian had seen the ad for the Dybbuk box on eBay. At first, it didn't seem like anything special, but then they read the very detailed description Kevin had written. He had listed all the strange and terrible things that had happened to him since he had acquired it. Kevin's angle was clearly to advertise it to people who were interested in the paranormal, and Sam and Brian were exactly that demographic. They were actively looking for items online that were supposedly haunted because they wanted to see for themselves if ghosts and paranormal phenomena were real. They were eager to buy the Dybbuk box and put it to the test. About 3 weeks later, the package finally arrived at their apartment in Missouri. Brian was still out at class, but Sam was home. He excitedly received the package, brought it into their kitchen, and carefully unpacked it. He set the box on the kitchen table. Just a few minutes later, Brian came home. Brian would say in later interviews that the moment he walked in the front door, the entire apartment smelled like someone had peed everywhere. It was a strong, foul smell of urine. He walked around, trying to figure out what had happened, where the terrible smell was coming from. He walked into the kitchen, where the smell was the strongest, and there was Sam standing proudly next to this old, creepy-looking chest, which was, of course, the Dybbuk box. Brian realized immediately that the box was the source of the smell. He looked at Sam and said, "Sam, do you smell that?" And Sam just grinned and said, "Yeah, that's the smell of ghosts." They were treating the whole thing as a huge joke. Sam even joked about how he couldn't wait to sleep in the same bed as the Dybbuk box. Sam had also started a blog where he was planning to document everything that happened from day one of receiving the box until they either got rid of it or something spectacular happened. For the first 2 weeks, they had the box, absolutely nothing happened. But then, Sam started bringing the Dybbuk box out and leaving it right in the middle of the huge parties they would throw in their apartment. People would spill beer on it, they'd open it up and put random things inside of it, they'd make jokes with it. And it was after they started doing this that they began to see a pretty significant uptick in strangeness inside their apartment. It started with their technology. Sam's laptop suddenly crashed, and the hard drive was completely unrecoverable. He had to buy a brand new laptop. All of their watches, both his and Brian's, just stopped working while they were in the house. No matter what they did, new batteries, taking them to a repair shop, the watches simply would not work. Their Xbox wouldn't turn on, but when they took it over to a friend's house, it worked just fine. It just refused to function inside their apartment. And their toaster, anytime you put bread in it, it would basically incinerate it instantly, no matter what setting it was on. None of these technological issues were particularly frightening to Sam or Brian. They were just frustrating. At first, they didn't even connect them to the Dybbuk box. It was just a weird string of bad luck. It wasn't until the light bulbs in their apartment started bursting in the middle of the night that they started to get genuinely creeped out. Now it was starting to seem like maybe, just maybe, if the box really was cursed, this is how it would manifest. They would replace a light bulb, and a day or two later, it would burst again. They couldn't keep their apartment lit because the bulbs just kept popping. But the worst part was when they suddenly had a massive insect infestation. All these bugs came out of nowhere, from inside the walls, out of the toilets, out of the drains in the sink. They came from behind the fridge, and they all seemed to converge on the Dybbuk box. At one point, the box was literally swarming with insects. It was completely covered. They had to shut the door to the room where they kept it because they couldn't even go in there. Despite how scary and disgusting this was, the boys had become a sort of cool talking point on campus because of Sam's blog, which a lot of other students were now following. They were kind of enjoying the weird notoriety they were getting from it, so they decided they didn't want to get rid of the box just yet. But it wasn't long after the insect infestation that Sam began losing all of his hair. It started falling out in clumps. At the exact same time, he started having a constant hallucination. He kept seeing an old woman in his peripheral vision on either side of his head pretty much at all times. No matter where he went, he had the feeling that someone he couldn't quite see was following him. It didn't matter if he was well rested or totally exhausted, he always saw this shrouded, dark figure that he believed was an old woman. It scared him so much that he couldn't sleep. He began going into Brian's room at night and just sitting on Brian's bed because it was the one place he felt even a little bit of comfort. But even as he sat there, he would still see these dark figures standing on either side of him all night long. Finally, no matter how popular their blog was, it all became too much. They decided they had to get rid of the Dybbuk box. They put it back on eBay, and it sold very quickly to a guy named Jason. Jason was a museum director at another university in Missouri. He had actually been following along with Sam's blog and was very interested in the whole story. When he saw it was listed for sale, he jumped at the chance to buy it. The boys eagerly shipped off the Dybbuk box, relieved to be rid of it. Jason received the package in the middle of a workday. He put the package in his truck and went back upstairs to his office to finish his day. Later that evening, after everyone else had left the building, he went back down to his truck, got the package, and brought it up to his office. He put it on his desk and cut open the packaging. Jason decided he wanted to evaluate the Dybbuk box the same way he would evaluate any other antique or artifact that was being considered for the museum he directed. He approached it with a scientific and skeptical mindset. He started by taking a whole series of photographs documenting every side of the box. Then he got out a blacklight and began scanning the outside of it. He found numerous traces of wax all over the exterior, which led him to believe it had probably been used in some kind of ritual. Then he took a deep breath, sat down directly in front of the box, popped off the old lock, and opened the doors. The drawer slid out just as it had for Kevin. Jason waited, but he was totally let down. Absolutely nothing happened. A part of him, despite his skepticism, thought that if this thing really was haunted, the moment he opened it, the haunting would begin. But there was nothing. No strange feelings, no weird sounds, nothing. He was pretty disappointed. After staring at the pennies, the shalom stone, and the locks of hair for a while, he concluded that he had gotten his hopes up for nothing. It was clearly a hoax. It was just a random old chest with a spooky story attached to it. He closed it up and put it on another desk in the office, one that he didn't work at. He figured it would just be a good talking point and a weird showpiece to tell his colleagues about. The next day, his colleagues came in and he explained the whole story of the Dybbuk box. He told them about its history, how it was supposed to be haunted, how it supposedly made people sick and caused strokes, how insects were known to swarm it. His colleagues thought it was a cool, creepy story, but they didn't think much of it either. That is, until all of the electronics inside their shared office started to fail. Their computers started crashing one by one. The IT department came up multiple times, and they were completely baffled. They told them they didn't know why it was happening, but the data was unrecoverable. Then the light bulbs in their office ceiling started going out constantly, to the point where they had to go out and buy a huge bulk pack of extra bulbs just to keep the room lit, something they had never had to do before. And then, finally, all of Jason's coworkers who shared that office space got sick all at the same time. And they all blamed the Dybbuk box. They came to Jason and said, "You know what? We were all fine until that thing came in here. Now our computers don't work, the lights don't work, and we're all sick. Get rid of it, Jason." So, that day after work, Jason took the Dybbuk box, put it in the back of his truck, which had a cover over the bed, and secured it. He drove home, but he didn't want to bring it inside his house. It just felt weird to bring a potentially cursed object, one that his coworkers had just forced him to remove from their office because it was making them sick, into his family home. He thought, okay, I'll just leave it in my truck overnight, and I'll figure out what I'm going to do with it tomorrow. He went inside, said hello to his family, and before long, it was time for bed. Jason went to sleep. To understand what happened next to Jason, you need to understand the layout of his house. When you opened the front door and walked inside, there was a staircase on your left that went up to the second floor. If you walked up that staircase, at the top, a bathroom was straight ahead. If you took a left and walked down the hall for a few feet, you came to the master suite where Jason and his wife slept. As you walked through the door to their bedroom, on the left-hand wall, there was a big bay window that looked out onto the street. There was a bright street light right outside that window, and it projected a very strong orangey yellow light into their room at night. On the other side of the room was their bed. The bed was positioned so that the foot of it pointed towards that window, and the head of the bed was against the opposite wall. Jason slept on the left side of the bed, the side furthest into the room. That night, Jason went to bed and fell asleep. But just a couple of hours later, he woke up suddenly. He was paralyzed. He couldn't move his body at all. He could only move his eyes. He was lying flat on his back, and the orange glow from the streetlight filled the entire room. He was lying there, trying desperately to move his hands, to move his legs, but he couldn't. As he was struggling, he started to hear footsteps out on the stairs. They were distinctive sounds, slow, heavy, plodding steps coming all the way up to the second floor. Jason was lying there, his eyes darting towards the open door of his bedroom, which gave him a partial view of the second floor landing. He was waiting, his heart pounding, to see who had come up the stairs. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a dark figure begin to walk into his room. His heart started racing even faster. He could tell it was definitely not someone he knew. It looked like an older woman with a shawl over her head, and her head was tucked down so he couldn't see her face. Because of the bright orange light coming in from the window, he could tell that this was a real, solid figure standing right there. This was not his imagination. The woman began shuffling her way across the foot of the bed. When she reached the foot of the bed, right in Jason's line of sight, she turned and looked directly at him. Then she ran around the corner of the bed, leaned over him, took her fingers, and drove them into his eyes. Jason felt it was real, and he started screaming in pain. And then he woke up. His wife was grabbing him, shaking him. Jason, what's wrong?" she was saying. He was disoriented. "What's going on?" he asked. She said, "Honey, it's just a bad dream." "You're fine." He was completely shaken up. His heart was still hammering in his chest from the nightmare. He was thinking to himself, that felt so real. He was touching his eyes. He couldn't believe that it was just a dream. It was the most vivid dream he had ever had in his entire life. Eventually, he managed to calm down and go back to sleep. The next morning, when he got up, he went into the bathroom, and when he looked in the mirror, he was horrified. His eyes were completely red all around the outside, and the whites of his eyes were filled with blood. They looked horrible, like he was having a terrible allergic reaction, or like someone had punched him, or maybe even gouged his eyes, just like in the dream. His wife came into the bathroom and gasped. "What happened to you?" she asked. He just looked at his reflection and said, "Oh my God, I have no idea." It was around this time that Jason began to seriously think that the Dybbuk box might just be cursed. The two previous owners had both mentioned in their eBay descriptions that horrible, vivid dreams, including physical manifestations, were a part of owning the box. Jason considered just throwing the thing in a dumpster somewhere, but then he worried that he would just be passing on this curse to some other unsuspecting person. He decided he would give it one more day and do some proper research about how to handle an object like this. That night, when Jason came back from work, he left the Dybbuk box in his truck again, still covered up in his driveway. He went inside, had dinner with his family, and later he was sitting in the living room watching television with his son. As they were quietly watching TV, Jason heard his son say, "Hey, Dad, who is that?" He looked over at his son, who was pointing at something behind him. Jason turned around, and standing right behind his chair was the exact same woman from his dream, the woman with the shawl who had gouged his eyes. And then, just as quickly as she appeared, she was gone. Jason looked at his son, his eyes wide. "You just saw that too?" he asked. His son nodded. "Yeah, who was that?" Jason grabbed his son, yelled for his wife, and said, "We have to leave the house right now." His wife came downstairs, confused. "What's going on?" she asked. He said, "I will explain in the car." "We have to take your car." His wife could see how serious and terrified Jason was, so she just said, "Okay." They all got into her car and drove down the road. That's when Jason finally explained everything that was going on with the Dybbuk box, how he and his son had just seen the same woman from his dream, the one that attacked him and made his eyes bleed. His wife and son were now terrified. The solution they came up with was to drive back to their house and drop Jason off. He was going to get in his truck, where the Dybbuk box was still locked in the back, and he was going to drive it a few miles outside of town to a rental property they owned that was currently empty. He was going to put the box in the basement of that house where it would stay until they could figure out how to properly dispose of it. They didn't like the idea of just dumping it because if this thing was real, they didn't want someone else to be cursed by it. So, Jason was dropped off. He got in his truck, drove to the rental property, carried the box into the basement, sealed it up, and then drove back to his house. Once Jason got back home, his wife and son returned as well. That night, Jason went on eBay and found the contact information for Kevin Mannis, the original owner of the box from the estate sale. He called him that night, and to his surprise, Kevin actually picked up. The two of them spoke at length, and Kevin ultimately agreed to help Jason find a way to properly dispose of the box. What Kevin offered to do was to drive back to the house where he had originally bought the box and see if he could find any more information about what it was and what to do with it. The next day, Kevin, the antique shop owner, drove back to the house from the estate sale. He knocked on the door, and an old woman answered. Kevin introduced himself and said, "Hi, I was here not too long ago, and I purchased lot 29, the one that included that Dybbuk box. I was hoping to get some more information about it." The woman's face immediately changed. She said, I told my family not to sell that. I know what was inside of it, and I know you're not supposed to open it. I tried to tell them, but they didn't listen. I really hope you didn't open it. Kevin's heart sank. Actually, he said, I did open it. He then described all the horrible things that had happened to him, and he told her about selling it and how all the subsequent owners had suffered, leading up to Jason in Missouri, who was now desperate to find a way to contain it. That's when the woman, whose name was Sophie, described what was actually inside the box. Sophie said she had lived in Poland before World War II with her cousin Havila, who was the woman who had passed away. She said that at the time, it was all the rage to have seances and try to talk to spirits. They would just do it for fun. Sophie, Havila, and their mother would gather around a table. Havila had even made her own Ouija board by stitching letters onto a blanket that they would drape over the table. They would all hold a pendant that was suspended by a chain and ask questions, hoping a spirit would move the pendant to spell out answers. Sophie said for a long time, nothing ever happened. It was just a silly game. But one time, it worked. The chain suddenly went rigid in their hands, and the pendant started swinging wildly, pointing to the letters over and over, spelling out the words, "Release me. Release me. Release me." Sophie said at first they were just shocked and didn't believe it. But then they started to worry. What if it was a Dybbuk, a malevolent spirit, and if they didn't help it, it would find a way to attach itself to one of them? Sophie said they devised their own ritual. They decided to release it, but to release it into an old wine box that they could shut and lock. And that wine box became the Dybbuk box, the very same one that was sold to Kevin. Kevin told Sophie, "What do we do? We've already opened it." And she said, "You need to contact a rabbi." And so they did. Jason and Kevin worked with a group of rabbis who were able to perform a ritual to reclaim the Dybbuk inside the box. They locked it, sealed it, and put it away in a secret location where it has supposedly been ever since 2003. And apparently, since it's been sealed off, both Jason and Kevin have said they have experienced no more strange or demonic activity. And they say they never plan to tell anybody where the box is because they don't want anyone else to ever have the opportunity to reopen it and deal with all the horrible things that they went through. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In the 1960s and 1970s, hitchhiking became incredibly popular among young people across America. It was a time defined by a spirit of counterculture, exploration, and a widespread sense of communal trust. Hitchhiking was viewed as a normal, socially acceptable, and highly efficient form of alternative transportation. The mechanics of it were simple and universally understood. A traveler would stand on the side of a busy highway, extend their arm, and hold their thumb upward to signal passing motorists that they needed a ride. If a driver felt inclined to help, they would pull over to the shoulder, the hitchhiker would hop into the vehicle, and they would set off toward a shared destination. Today, the idea of getting into a car with a complete stranger, or conversely, picking up an unknown person from the side of the road, seems unfathomably dangerous. Modern society views the practice with intense skepticism shaped by decades of cautionary tales. But in the late 1970s, it was still considered a routine way for a young person to travel across the vast expanses of the United States. It was with this mindset that 15-year-old Mary Vincent found herself standing on the side of a highway just outside of Modesto, California, on the 29th of September, 1978. Modesto was a city located in California's Central Valley, not terribly far from the bustling hub of San Francisco. Mary was a rebellious, fiercely independent teenager who had recently run away from her family home in Las Vegas, Nevada. Her parents were going through an incredibly bitter, hostile, and exhausting divorce, and the atmosphere inside her house had become entirely unbearable for her. Desperate to escape the emotional turmoil and constant arguments, Mary decided to leave. She used the universal network of hitchhiking to travel all the way from Las Vegas down to Los Angeles, California, where her grandfather lived. However, after spending just a couple of days at her grandfather's home, the reality of her situation began to set in. The initial adrenaline of running away faded, replaced by an overwhelming, suffocating wave of homesickness. Despite the chaos of her parents' crumbling marriage, Mary deeply missed her family, her siblings, and the comfort of the familiar. She desperately wanted to return to Las Vegas. One afternoon, while her grandfather was out of the house running errands, Mary decided to act on her feelings. She quietly slipped out of his home, carrying a small bag of personal belongings, and headed toward the highway to begin the long journey back to Nevada. Hitchhiking alone as a teenage girl was difficult and slow, but Mary managed to secure a series of rides that brought her northward from Los Angeles up to Modesto. The drivers who had helped her so far were ordinary, decent people who simply wanted to assist a traveling teenager. By the time she reached Modesto, she was positioned on a stretch of highway looking for another vehicle that could take her farther south and east back toward Las Vegas. On this particular afternoon, Mary was not entirely alone. She had grouped up with two other young hitchhikers who were also trying to travel down the coast. Together, the three teenagers stood in a small huddle on the shoulder of the road. To make their intentions completely clear to passing motorists, they were holding up cardboard signs that boldly read, "Going South." They hoped that traveling as a group would make them look safer and perhaps encourage a driver with a larger vehicle to pick them all up. In the middle of the afternoon, a light blue passenger van slowed down as it approached the trio. The van belonged to a man who appeared to be in his 50s. He looked completely ordinary, harmless, and unthreatening, the kind of older man who easily blended into a crowd. Seeing their signs, the driver pulled the van over to the side of the highway, parking about 15 feet ahead of where the teenagers were standing. Mary's two companions stayed back, waiting to see what the driver would say, while Mary eagerly ran forward to initiate the conversation. She walked up to the passenger side of the van, where the window had already been rolled down. Looking inside, she saw that the driver was alone, and the back of the van was completely wide open, offering plenty of space. Mary politely addressed the man, asking if he would be willing to give all three of them a ride, since they were all heading south. The man looked directly at Mary and shook his head. He replied in a calm but firm voice, stating that he could only give her a ride and that he would not accommodate the other two teenagers. Mary felt an immediate wave of confusion and hesitation. She looked past him into the interior of the light blue van, noting the abundance of empty space. There were no large boxes, no extra passengers, and no obvious reasons why three teenagers couldn't easily fit inside. She gently prodded the man, asking him if he was absolutely sure he couldn't take her friends along, emphasizing that they were all traveling to the exact same area. The man did not offer a complex explanation. He simply repeated himself with chilling finality, making it clear that he would take her, but he absolutely would not take the others. Sensing that this was her only immediate option, Mary told the driver to wait for a moment while she retrieved her bag. She walked back to her two companions and explained the driver's strict condition. Her friends instantly grew alarmed. They told Mary that something felt incredibly wrong about the situation. They pointed out that a normal, well-meaning driver with an empty van would have no logical reason to refuse two extra passengers who were heading in the exact same direction. They explicitly warned her not to get into the vehicle, sensing an unspoken danger. Mary harbored her own internal reservations. A small, quiet voice in her mind told her that her friends were right. But her intense desire to get home completely clouded her judgment. She was so deeply homesick, so physically exhausted from days of traveling, and so desperate to see her parents that she could not bear the thought of waiting on the highway shoulder for another night. She knew that not every driver was willing to pick up hitchhikers, and she feared that if she turned this ride down, she might be stuck in Modesto for days. Overriding her instincts and ignoring the pleas of her companions, Mary grabbed her bag and told them that she was going to take the risk. She said goodbye, ran back to the waiting light blue van, opened the passenger door, and climbed inside. As soon as Mary sat down and pulled the door shut, the man immediately shifted the van into gear, pulled out onto the highway, and merged into the flow of traffic. Once they were cruising down the road, the driver turned to Mary with a polite smile and introduced himself. He said his name was Lawrence Singleton, and he confirmed that he was 50 years old. Mary introduced herself in return, and the two began to engage in casual, polite small talk. Lawrence was highly skilled at projecting an aura of safety and warmth. As they drove, his calm demeanor and gentle tone of voice completely put Mary at ease. Within a short period, her initial anxiety began to melt away entirely. To Mary, Lawrence did not look like a predator. He reminded her of her own grandfather, a kind, harmless older man who was simply doing a favor for a stranded teenager. Because she had been running on pure adrenaline and very little sleep for the past few days, the comforting environment of the moving van made Mary incredibly drowsy. She turned to Lawrence and asked if he would mind if she closed her eyes and took a quick nap while he drove. Lawrence smiled warmly and told her it was no problem at all, encouraging her to get some rest. Relieved, Mary curled up in the passenger seat, turned her body away from him, and closed her eyes. Within minutes, she fell into a deep, trusting sleep. A significant amount of time passed before Mary finally woke up. As her eyes adjusted and she looked out the passenger window, she noticed the positioning of the sun and the landmarks along the road. Her heart sank as she realized that the geography was entirely wrong. They were not traveling south towards Southern California and Nevada, they were heading in the exact opposite direction. Mary immediately turned to Lawrence and pointed out the error, telling him that they were going the wrong way. Lawrence acted surprised, hitting the steering wheel lightly and claiming that he had simply made a foolish navigational mistake. He apologized profusely, assuring her that he would find the next available exit, turn the van around, and get them back on the correct path. Mary nodded, trying to accept his excuse, but deep down, a profound sense of dread began to take root. They had traveled miles in the wrong direction. It felt statistically impossible for an experienced adult driver to make such a massive, prolonged error by accident. True to his word, however, Lawrence exited the highway, turned the light blue van around, and began driving south. This action temporarily confused Mary's instinct. If he was a dangerous kidnapper, why would he willingly turn the car back around toward her desired destination? Despite this, Mary remained completely on edge. Her senses were highly heightened, but she was careful to keep her face neutral and her voice calm. She knew she was trapped in a moving vehicle with an older, stronger adult, and she did not want to trigger an aggressive reaction by showing her intense fear or accusing him of lying. She sat silently in the passenger seat, watching the passing landscape with growing apprehension. Eventually, the van left the main interstate and entered a long, isolated stretch of secondary highway that wound through a heavily forested, densely wooded area. The surrounding trees grew thick and tall, blocking out much of the natural sunlight, and the traffic on this particular road completely thinned out until Lawrence's van was the only vehicle in sight. Suddenly, Lawrence broke the silence. He turned to Mary and announced that he needed to pull the van over immediately because he had to use the bathroom. Mary felt her stomach drop. The isolation of the forest was terrifying, but she tried to maintain her composure. She gave a tight, apprehensive nod and muttered that it was fine. As Lawrence began to slow the van down and steer it toward the edge of the road, Mary instinctively looked down at her own feet. She noticed that one of her sneakers had come completely untied. A sudden, sharp realization flashed through her mind. If this man tried to attack her, she would need to run as fast as possible, and a loose shoe would cause her to trip and fall. She knew she needed to tie the shoe immediately, but she was too terrified to bend down and do it while they were still in the front seats. The space was incredibly cramped, and she worried that making a sudden movement to tie her shoe would look highly suspicious to Lawrence, potentially causing him to launch an attack right there. She quickly decided that the moment the van came to a complete stop, she would open her door, step outside under the guise of stretching her legs, and immediately tie her laces on the solid ground. However, Lawrence did not simply pull over onto the dirt shoulder of the main road. Instead, he steered the light blue van onto a rugged, unpaved access road that cut deeply into the dense forest. As the van bumped along the dirt track, moving further and further away from the safety of the highway, absolute alarm bells began to scream inside Mary's head. She knew with absolute certainty that she was in profound danger. There was no innocent reason for a driver to navigate deep into an isolated forest just to relieve himself. Panic paralyzed her. She stared straight ahead, unable to look at Lawrence, her mind racing through every possible scenario. Should she try to jump out of the moving van? Should she scream? Should she confront him? Before she could form a coherent plan, Lawrence drove the van deep enough into the woods that they were completely invisible to anyone on the main highway. He brought the vehicle to a final stop, turned off the engine, and stepped out into the quiet forest. The moment Lawrence opened his door and stepped outside, Mary immediately opened the passenger door and scrambled out onto the dirt ground, desperate for fresh air and room to move. Keeping her head down, she immediately bent over and began reaching for her loose shoelaces, focused entirely on securing her footwear so she could prepare to run. But she never got the chance to finish. Before her fingers could tie the knot, a massive, crushing force struck her violently in the back of the head. The impact was so severe that it instantly short-circuited her nervous system, knocking her completely unconscious. Lawrence had not stepped out of the van to use the restroom. Before exiting, he had quietly reached down and grabbed a heavy hammer that he kept concealed right next to the driver's seat. He had silently walked around the front of the vehicle, crept up behind the unsuspecting 15-year-old girl, and smashed the heavy tool into her skull. When Mary finally regained consciousness, she found herself in total darkness. She was lying flat on her back on the hard metal floor in the rear cargo area of the light blue van. Her head was throbbing with excruciating, blinding pain, and she felt incredibly disoriented. As her vision slowly cleared, she looked out the rear windows of the van and realized that the vehicle was still parked in the exact same isolated spot deep within the forest. She instinctively tried to sit up and move her arms, but she immediately realized she was completely trapped. Lawrence had used heavy ropes and restraints to tie her hands and her feet securely to the interior structural frame of the van. She was pinned down, entirely immobile and completely at his mercy. Before she could fully process the horror of her restraint, she heard footsteps approaching the vehicle. Lawrence walked to the back of the van, swung the heavy rear doors wide open, and climbed into the cargo area. The polite, grandfatherly facade he had maintained on the highway was entirely gone. His face was cold, detached, and monstrous. Without saying a single word, he immediately launched a brutal, vicious, and prolonged physical and sexual assault against the bound teenager. Mary was absolutely terrified, a young child trapped in a living nightmare with a sadistic adult. She did not have the physical strength to fight back against her restraints, so she resorted to the only weapon she had left, her voice. As Lawrence assaulted her, Mary began to quietly, desperately beg for her life. Over and over again, through heavy tears, she whimpered, pleading with him to stop, promising him that if he just let her go, she would never tell a single soul what he had done to her. She promised to keep his secret forever if he would just show her a shred of mercy. Lawrence never responded to her pleas. He never spoke, he never yelled, and he never looked at her with remorse. He simply continued his horrific assault in absolute chilling silence for hours on end, ignoring her cries as the afternoon transitioned into the dark of night. Eventually, Lawrence grew physically exhausted. He finally stopped the assault, climbed out of the rear cargo area, and walked around to the front of the van. He climbed into the driver's seat, leaned his head back, and fell into a deep sleep. Back in the dark cargo hold, Mary lay in absolute agony. She spent the long night hours frantically pulling and twisting against the ropes, desperate to find some slack that would allow her to free her hands or feet. But Lawrence had tied the knots with expert, unyielding precision. The tight ropes only cut deeper into her skin, leaving her entirely unable to escape. She was left alone with her thoughts in the pitch black, weeping silently, wondering if she would ever see her family again, and fearing what this monster would do to her when he woke up. In the middle of the night, Lawrence suddenly awoke. Without uttering a word to the terrified girl in the back, he started the van's engine, shifted into gear, and drove out of the forest access road. He navigated back onto the main highway and drove through the darkness for a significant distance. Mary lay in the back, shifting violently with the movement of the van, completely unaware of where they were going. Eventually, Lawrence turned off the highway onto another remote access road, driving deep into an entirely different wilderness area. This time, he navigated the van down into the deep, rocky isolation of a massive desert canyon, far away from any potential witnesses or prying eyes. He brought the van to a final stop, walked around to the back, and opened the doors once again. Mary, battered and weeping, began her desperate begging all over again, crying out for freedom. But Lawrence remained entirely deaf to her suffering. He climbed back into the van, and the horrific torture and assault resumed, continuing unabated through the final hours of the night until the dark sky finally began to break and the morning sun rose over the canyon walls. When the sunlight finally illuminated the interior of the van, Lawrence stopped. He climbed out of the vehicle and stood on the dirt ground, staring in at his victim. He reached forward and, to Mary's immense shock, began to untie the heavy restraints that bound her limbs. He pulled her battered, bloodied body out of the cargo hold and forced her to stand upright on her feet. Mary was entirely weak, her body covered in deep bruises and blood, her spirit nearly broken. Believing that this might be the moment of her release, she looked at him with tears in her eyes and whispered a final plea, asking him to please just let her go home. Lawrence looked at her with a cruel, mocking expression. He repeated her words back to her, stating that since she wanted to be set free so badly, he was going to set her free. He walked away from her toward the front of the van, reached into a heavy metal toolbox, and pulled out a sharp, heavy-duty hatchet. Mary had only a fraction of a second to realize what was happening before Lawrence closed the distance between them. In one fluid, terrifying motion, he used his left hand to firmly grab Mary's left wrist, anchoring her arm in place. With his right hand, he raised the heavy hatchet high into the air and brought it down with massive force onto her left forearm. The sharp blade sliced cleanly through her flesh, muscle, and bone, completely severing her left arm off her body just below the elbow joint. The sheer shock and physical trauma caused Mary to fall backward onto the hard dirt ground. She stared down in absolute horror at the gaping, spurting wound where her left arm had been just moments before. Her brain struggled to process the unimaginable agony. But before she could even scream, Lawrence stepped over her. He reached down with his left hand, grabbed her right wrist, and pinned it down. Mary knew with absolute certainty what was coming next. Terrified and fighting for her life, she began to scream at the top of her lungs, kicking her legs out violently, striking Lawrence's body with all the remaining strength she possessed in a desperate bid to force him off her. But Lawrence's grip on her right wrist was unyielding. He raised the hatchet again and began hacking at her right forearm. It took 4 separate, brutal, agonizing blows of the hatchet to finally cut through the bone and completely sever her right arm from her body. Mary collapsed into a crumpled heap on the ground, bleeding profusely from both of her severed limbs, her body experiencing a level of physical pain that few human beings have ever survived. As she lay there screaming, Lawrence did not look at her face. Instead, his attention was completely caught by something bizarre and horrific. When he had severed Mary's left arm, her hand had instinctively clutched onto the sleeve of his shirt in a final death grip. Now, her severed left hand was still firmly attached to his clothing. With an air of absolute indifference and nonchalance, Lawrence stood over her, completely ignoring her screams, and began casually flicking his arm, trying to shake the severed hand off his sleeve. After a few moments, the hand finally detached and fell to the earth. Lawrence turned his attention back to Mary and noticed that she had suddenly gone entirely silent. Her body had gone completely limp, and she was lying motionless in a massive, expanding pool of her own blood. Believing that she had finally succumbed to blood loss and shock, Lawrence calmly walked back to his van, placed the bloody hatchet inside his toolbox, and walked back over to her seemingly lifeless body. He grabbed Mary by her shoulders and began dragging her body across the dirt ground, leaving a thick trail of blood in his wake. About 100 feet down the remote canyon road, the path ran directly over a massive concrete culvert, a giant drainage tunnel built deep underneath the roadway to allow water and heavy storm runoff to pass safely beneath the concrete without washing the road away. This particular culvert was constructed roughly 30 feet below the actual surface of the road. If a person stood on the edge of the road, there was a steep, near-vertical 30-foot drop-off down onto a bed of jagged rocks and boulders that surrounded the opening of the drainage tunnel. Lawrence dragged Mary's limp body directly to the edge of this precipice. Without a single hint of hesitation, he threw her body over the side, sending her plunging 30 feet down through the air to smash violently against the jagged rocks below. Lawrence then carefully navigated his way down the steep dirt embankment to the bottom of the canyon. He walked over to her crumpled body, picked her up, and stuffed her deep inside the dark, cold concrete interior of the culvert drainage pipe, hiding her from view. As he turned his back to walk away and leave her to die alone in the wilderness, he looked into the tunnel and uttered a final, chilling sentence. "Now you're free." But miracles do happen, and Mary Vincent was not dead. Legally, medically, and physically, she should have died at multiple different points during this horrific sequence of events. She should have died from the initial hammer blow, the massive blood loss from 2 severed limbs, the shock of the amputations, or the severe internal trauma of being thrown down a 30-foot cliff onto solid rock. But against all mathematical and medical odds, her heart kept beating. Later in her life, Mary would recount the terrifying reality that she was completely lucid, fully conscious, and profoundly aware of everything that happened to her during the entire attack, except for the brief moment she was knocked out by the hammer. She vividly remembered the sensation of her arms being severed. She recalled that when Lawrence first grabbed her left wrist, she had instinctively clamped her fingers down onto his shirt sleeve, trying to anchor herself. When the hatchet came down and severed her arm, she remembered falling backward, but her brain experienced a strange phenomenon where time seemed to slow down to an absolute crawl. As she fell through the air, she looked up and literally saw her own severed hand still firmly gripping the sleeve of Lawrence's shirt, detached from her body. When Lawrence began hacking at her right arm, Mary realized that if she continued to scream, kick, and fight, he would realize she was still alive and would likely use the hatchet to cut her throat or smash her skull. In a moment of supreme instinctual genius, she forced her entire body to go completely limp. She kept her eyes half open, maintaining a blank, glazed stare, and completely stopped breathing out loud. She watched through her eyelashes as Lawrence casually flicked her severed hand off his arm. She remained absolutely still and silent as he dragged her across the dirt, and she did not make a single sound or whimper when he threw her body off the 30-foot drop-off. The fall broke 4 of her ribs and caused immense internal agony, but her fierce will to survive told her that she had to endure the punishment in absolute silence, or he would finish her off. She lay perfectly still inside the dark concrete culvert, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading away, followed by the distant sound of his van engine starting up and driving off into the distance. Even after the van left, Mary did not immediately move. She worried that Lawrence might have parked his van further up the road and could be waiting at the top of the cliff, watching to see if she would crawl out. She forced herself to lie in a contorted, agonizing position inside the cold pipe for a long time. Eventually, the extreme blood loss began to take its toll, and an overwhelming, heavy wave of fatigue washed over her. She felt herself slipping toward unconsciousness, but she suddenly heard a distinct, powerful voice echoing inside her own mind. The voice told her with absolute clarity, "You cannot go to sleep. If you go to sleep right now, you are going to die. And if you die, this monster will get away with what he did, and he will do this to someone else." This thought triggered a massive, life-saving surge of adrenaline through her system. Mary made a definitive decision. She was going to live, and she was going to bring her attacker to justice. She slowly dragged her broken body out of the dark culvert. Once she was out on the canyon floor, she looked at the raw, bleeding nubs of her forearms. Knowing that she was rapidly bleeding to death, she dug the exposed bones and flesh of her arms directly into the dirt and mud, manually packing the open wounds with soil to create a crude, natural tourniquet to stop the bleeding. Then she realized that if she walked with her arms down, the gravity would cause her remaining blood and muscle tissue to slip out of the wounds. She raised her mutilated forearms high above her head and began the impossible task of climbing up the steep 30-foot embankment. Using her feet, her knees, and her broken ribs, she crawled and scratched her way up the dirt cliff until she finally reached the edge of the road. She was completely naked, covered from head to toe in thick mud, dirt, and her own blood, looking like a figure from a horror movie. She began to run down the highway, desperate for help. A car soon approached, but the driver was so utterly terrified by the sight of a blood-soaked, armless figure running down the road in the middle of nowhere that they panicked, stepped on the gas, and drove right past her. Refusing to give up, Mary kept running. She ran for 3 agonizing miles down the hot highway under the morning sun until she finally managed to flag down another vehicle. This car was occupied by a young couple. Though they were initially struck with absolute horror and shock by Mary's appearance, they quickly realized she was a victim in desperate need of help. They lifted her into their vehicle and sped down the highway toward the nearest hospital. Mary Vincent spent the next full month in the hospital undergoing intensive surgeries to save her life, treat her broken ribs, and clean her infected arm wounds. Throughout her grueling physical recovery, her mind remained sharp. She met with police detectives and provided them with an incredibly precise, highly detailed description of Lawrence Singleton, his physical features, his age, and the exact appearance of his light blue passenger van. Using her stellar memory, forensic artists created a highly accurate composite sketch of the attacker, which was immediately broadcast across television news and printed in local newspapers. Not long after the sketch was released, one of Lawrence Singleton's neighbors recognized the drawing and the description of the van. The neighbor contacted the police, leading to Singleton's immediate arrest. He was brought to trial, where Mary Vincent bravely took the witness stand, looked her attacker in the eye, and testified in detail about the horrors he had inflicted upon her. Singleton was found guilty of multiple counts, including kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder. However, due to the specific laws of California in 1978, the maximum sentence the judge could legally hand down for these crimes was a mere 14 years in prison. The judge expressed immense frustration, stating on the record that he wished he could lock Singleton away for life, but his hands were legally tied by the statute. As Mary was leaving the courthouse following the sentencing, she had to walk directly past Singleton. He leaned in close to the young girl, lowered his voice, and whispered a terrifying promise. "I will finish the job if it takes me the rest of my life." Because of automatic prison credits for good behavior and his work as a teacher's assistant behind bars, Lawrence Singleton was paroled in 1986, having served just 8 years of his 14-year sentence. His release sparked massive public outrage and protests across California. Mary, who had since grown up, gotten married, and given birth to 2 sons, was absolutely paralyzed with fear. She spent years looking over her shoulder, terrified that her stalker would fulfill his vow to finish the job and murder her and her children. But Singleton did not go after Mary. Instead, he relocated to Florida, where his violent, predatory nature inevitably resurfaced. In 1997, nearly 20 years after his attack on Mary, Singleton brutally attacked and murdered a 31-year-old mother of 3 named Roxanne Hayes in his home. He stabbed her multiple times, ending her life. At his murder trial in Florida, Mary Vincent bravely traveled to the courtroom to testify against him once again, providing the jury with first-hand evidence of his history of extreme sadistic violence. Her powerful testimony was instrumental in helping the prosecution secure a definitive death sentence for Singleton. However, before the state of Florida could execute him, Lawrence Singleton died of cancer in a prison hospital room in the year 2001. When Mary received the news of his death, she admitted to feeling deeply cheated that he had died of natural causes rather than facing the executioner. However, her sons expressed immense relief that the monster who had haunted their mother's life was finally gone forever, and Mary took great solace in knowing he could never hurt another soul. The widespread public fury over Singleton's early release in California, combined with the tragic preventable death of Roxanne Hayes, led directly to a major overhaul of the American legal system. Lawmakers drafted and passed a landmark piece of legislation known as the Lawrence Singleton Bill. This law fundamentally changed sentencing guidelines for violent crimes, giving judges the explicit legal authority to hand down sentences of 25 years to life for any criminal acts that involved explicit torture, aggravated mayhem, or the intentional mutilation of a victim's body. Under the rules of this bill, if Lawrence Singleton had committed his horrific crimes against Mary Vincent today, he would never have been granted parole, he would never have walked free, and Roxanne Hayes would still be alive. Mary Vincent refused to let her trauma define the rest of her existence. She went on to become a highly accomplished artist and an outspoken advocate for victims of violent crime. Using custom-designed prosthetic arms that she learned to master with incredible dexterity, she reclaimed her life, her independence, and her joy, standing as a permanent symbol of the unbreakable power of the human spirit. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On a Saturday afternoon in February of 2011, an 18-year-old college student named Michael Perry found himself 1,000 feet underground inside one of America's most dangerous cave systems. He was crouched low inside a vast, dark cavern in Lafayette, Georgia, surrounded by 4 of his friends. As Michael shifted his weight, the beam from his headlamp danced across the cave walls, catching slick rock formations dripping with moisture. The light briefly illuminated underground waterfalls cascading through the darkness before vanishing into deep black crevices that seemed to have no bottom. The entire place felt alien, cold, and completely cut off from the sunny world above. And before that day was over, 2 people inside that cave would be dead. The cave they were exploring was called Ellison Cave. Michael and his friends had driven more than 400 miles from their college town in Gainesville, Florida, just to see it. Ellison was famous among experienced cavers. It was a sprawling underground maze filled with narrow tunnels, massive vertical drops, freezing waterfalls, and pitch-black chambers that could turn deadly in an instant if something went wrong. Every year, adventurers from all over the country traveled there looking for excitement. But, to be perfectly clear, this kind of activity, caving, it was not really Michael's thing. Not at all. He was a marketing major at the University of Florida. If you asked him to describe himself, he would have said he was a pretty quiet person. He enjoyed studying, he liked playing in his school's band, and he dedicated a lot of his time to volunteering with his church youth group. So the idea of crawling through a tiny, pitch-black, intensely claustrophobic hole hundreds of feet beneath the Earth's surface, that did not rank high on his list of fun things to do. In fact, it probably wasn't on the list at all. But Michael wasn't in Ellison Cave that day for fun. He was there for a very specific reason, and that reason was his close friend, a guy named Grant Lockenbach. Grant had been the one to suggest the trip. He was passionate about it, and when Grant got an idea in his head, he was very persuasive. So Michael, being a good friend, had simply said, "Okay, I'll go with you." Just then, Michael glanced over to where Grant was sitting. He was with his girlfriend, a young woman named Carrie, and their 2 other friends were there as well. The group of them were huddled together, looking through a large backpack. They were taking inventory, checking over the various pieces of specialized gear they had brought along with them for the expedition. They had only entered Ellison Cave a few minutes ago, but they had already stopped. The group had paused their progress because there was something in this specific area of the cave that Grant was absolutely determined to see. And when Grant wanted to do something, it almost always happened. That was just the kind of person he was. It's why Michael, despite his reservations, had capitulated and ended up deep inside this mountain. Grant wanted him to come, and so, like he normally did, Michael went along with it. Grant was a natural leader. He was the president of their school's Fellowship of Christian Athletes, a group that Michael, Carrie, and the other 2 friends were also devoted members of. When Michael had first joined the fellowship, Grant had immediately taken him under his wing. He saw something in Michael. He told him that he had tons of potential. In fact, Grant had said that Michael had enough potential to one day become the next president of the fellowship himself. Hearing this from Grant had been a huge deal for Michael. It gave him a massive boost of confidence because he really truly looked up to Grant. And he wasn't alone in that. A lot of people did. Grant was just one of those effortlessly cool guys. He was a few years older than Michael, stood about 6 feet tall, and was basically a walking, talking ball of positive energy. He was always on the lookout for the next adventure, the next challenge to conquer. Caving was one of those adventures. Grant had been exploring caves as a serious hobby for the past 3 years, and out of everyone in their group that day, he was the only one with any real practical caving experience. And it was precisely because of this lack of experience among the others, Michael included, that Grant had chosen an easier route for them. They were navigating a tunnel within Ellison that was basically a straight shot through the mountain. It was a beginner's trail. It didn't require much in the way of technical gear, like ropes or complex climbing equipment. But despite the low level of difficulty for their chosen path, they had brought all of that extra equipment anyway. They had ropes and harnesses and carabiners. They had it all. And that was because along this easier route, right at the spot where they were now stopped, was the entrance to a massive vertical shaft. And Grant specifically wanted to climb down into it, even if he had to go alone. This particular shaft was 125 feet deep. To put that in perspective, imagine a 10-story building. That's how far this pit dropped straight down into the earth. But in the world of serious caving, this was actually considered a small one. It was officially called the warm-up pit, because compared to the other, much deeper pits inside Ellison Cave, it was nothing. Some of the other vertical drops in the cave were way, way deeper, some over 500 feet. So while this was definitely not a beginner's task, for an experienced caver like Grant, it was a manageable, almost routine challenge. Michael watched as Grant picked up the backpack, the one with all the equipment inside, and carried it over to the entrance of the pit. The entrance was just a very large, dark hole in the cave floor. It was situated over near a noisy waterfall, and it was only a few feet away from where Michael was standing. So Michael walked over to Grant to offer his help. He wanted to assist him in setting up the gear for his descent. The process involved attaching a long climbing rope securely to the rocks around the pit's edge, creating an anchor that Grant could then use to lower himself safely into the darkness below. This whole setup process is called rigging. It took them a while to get it all done. Michael, again, had no experience with any of this, so he had to wait for Grant to instruct him on every single step. He would hold a rope here, check a knot there, all under Grant's careful direction. But as Michael worked alongside his friend, he found himself peering down into that pitch-black hole. As he looked down into what felt like a bottomless abyss, he felt his stomach do a little flip. He was suddenly very, very glad that he had not promised Grant he would go down into the pit with him. Because seeing it now, up close and in person, it was terrifying. He wanted no part of going down into that thing. But Grant clearly did. His eyes were bright with excitement. He was in his element. So Michael and Grant continued the process of getting Grant all set up. And then, eventually, when Grant was fully rigged and ready to go, Michael heard a strange sound. It was the sound of something heavy sliding off a rock. And then, just moments later, that sound was followed by a loud, echoing thud that seemed to come from deep, deep inside the hole, from the bottom of the warm-up pit. For a brief moment, Michael was just confused. He didn't know what he had just heard. Maybe it was just a loose rock that had tumbled into the pit. But then he looked over at Grant. Grant had a very unhappy expression on his face, and he was staring at the ground right next to the edge of the pit. He was looking at the spot where their backpack had been sitting just a second ago. The backpack with all of their extra equipment inside? At least, the equipment they weren't currently using. And the backpack was no longer there. It was gone. The backpack had just fallen 125 feet straight down into the pit. Now, obviously, this was not good. The last thing they wanted was for their backpack to be at the bottom of that hole. But it was actually much worse than just potentially losing some of their equipment. Because inside of that bag was the only cell phone they had brought with them into the cave. And it was also where they had stored all of their extra ropes and other essential climbing gear. They had taken some things out, of course, to get Grant rigged up for his descent, but losing that bag felt really, really bad. Without the contents of that backpack, they could easily get stranded or trapped deep inside of this cave, and they wouldn't be able to call or text anyone for help. They would be completely stuck. And so Michael could feel a wave of panic starting to wash over him. But then Grant cut in. He played it cool, as he always did. He just looked at the group and said, "Look, it's no big deal." He would just go down there and get it. I mean, he was already planning on going into the hole anyway, and he was all rigged up and ready to go after all. So he would simply go down, retrieve the bag, and come back up. It would be fine. And then, before Michael or Grant's girlfriend, Carrie, or any of the other friends could say a word, Grant just strapped on his harness and a pair of ascenders. Ascenders are climbing tools that would help him move down the rope in a controlled, measured way. He began positioning himself at the edge of the pit, preparing to go down. Michael just watched Grant in complete awe. Grant was so confident, so in control, that he was able to make everyone else around him feel calm too. And Michael felt his own panic starting to subside just from watching Grant's unshakable demeanor. This wasn't the first time Grant had projected such calm in the face of danger. During Grant's freshman year of college, he had casually climbed up the entire exterior of one of their school's tallest dormitories just to see if he could do it. And he did. He had also joined the school's ROTC program, which is a military reserve training program, and as part of that, he had learned how to jump out of airplanes. So he had skydived, another one of his thrill-seeking activities. This moment here in the cave seemed like yet another perfect example of why Grant was such an incredible and natural leader. And as Michael watched him, he found himself hoping that by the time he potentially took over as president of the fellowship, he could be just as fearless, just as composed as Grant. But for now, Michael just watched as Grant very calmly lowered himself into the hole. And then he disappeared into the abyss below. For the next few minutes, it was very quiet in the cavern. All Michael could hear was the constant rushing sound of the nearby waterfall. So he and Carrie and the others just talked quietly amongst themselves. They waited for Grant to call back up to let them know that he had made it to the bottom and had successfully grabbed the backpack. And finally, they did hear Grant's voice. He did call out from somewhere deep down in that hole. But Michael couldn't really understand what Grant was saying. The waterfall that was blasting away nearby was really loud, and it created a lot of noise. And on top of that, Grant's voice echoed strangely around the stone walls of the cave, which made it almost impossible to tell what he was trying to say. So at this point, Michael and Carrie and the others, they weren't worried yet. They just figured this was an acoustics problem, not a safety problem. So Michael just walked over to the edge of the pit, and he leaned over carefully, trying to look down. But it was no use. He couldn't see Grant. He was too far down, and it was far too dark. And so Michael called out, asking Grant to repeat himself, explaining that they couldn't understand what he was saying from up there. And Grant did yell back. He clearly replied to Michael's call. But Michael still couldn't really make out the words. However, this time, there was something really different about the way Grant sounded. Again, even though he didn't know what Grant was saying, one thing was suddenly definitely clear. Grant no longer sounded like the calm, cool, and collected, fearless leader that he normally was. He was talking really, really fast. He was repeating himself. He was saying something over and over again very, very quickly with a sense of extreme urgency. And even though, again, it wasn't clear what the words were, the tone was unmistakable. Grant was scared. There was a problem. Now, obviously, problems can and do arise when you're rappelling into a 125-foot hole deep underground inside a cave. That can happen. But for Michael and the others, when they finally processed that something was seriously wrong for Grant, it was truly shocking. I mean, Grant is the guy that gets other people out of problems. He was the calm guy. Nothing ever rattled him. And so to hear him basically panicking, it was deeply unsettling for those of them standing at the surface. And so Michael and the others, they're kind of hit with this sudden dual realization. One, it's very unsettling to hear Grant sounding this way. But worse, two, is the fact that they are not cavers. They can't go into this pit and save Grant if he needs saving. Not only because they completely lacked the experience, but also because all the caving gear, all the climbing equipment was in that backpack that had fallen into the pit. It was down there with Grant. So there was no way they could realistically help him if he was in any sort of trouble down there. And also, their one and only cell phone was down there in that backpack in the pit as well. And so, unless Grant could somehow figure out whatever problem he was having and get himself back up to the surface on his own, Michael and the others knew, without even having to say it out loud, that they were completely and utterly helpless. And so, as this grim realization is setting in for Michael and the other friends, Grant goes from trying to talk to them, even though, again, they can't tell what he's saying, he just sounds panicked, to straight up screaming. He is screaming for them. Something is horribly, horribly wrong. And so Michael and Carrie, they start yelling down to Grant, trying desperately to get him to clarify what's going on. But you have this powerful waterfall that's causing all this noise and splashing water everywhere. It's dark. And Grant clearly is so panicked that he's not even listening to them anymore. And so it's just chaos. It's madness. And so Michael and Carrie, they turn to the other two friends that are with them. And they tell them, look, we're going to stay right here at this hole and wait for Grant. You two need to leave the cave right now. Go get help. And so the other two friends, they rushed off to do just that, disappearing back into the darkness of the tunnel. While Michael and Carrie just sat there by the edge of the pit, listening to Grant getting more and more hysterical by the second, somewhere far down in that black hole, they still had no idea what was wrong. But clearly, there was a major emergency happening. And so, for a little while after their friends had gone off to find help, Michael and Carrie, even though they're not really having a conversation with Grant because he's just kind of rambling and yelling and screaming and they still can't understand him, they're just kind of shouting down into the hole. They're yelling things like, everything's going to be okay. We've sent for help. It's going to be okay. You're going to get out of here soon. They had no idea if he could even hear them or understand what they were saying. They were just assuming that the acoustics were just as bad for him down there as they were for them up here. Again, the sound of that waterfall was so incredibly loud. It was so dark. And so they're just having this awful, helpless moment. But then something cut through all of that chaos. At some point, Michael heard Grant say something that he really did understand. Grant, at some point, in a very high-pitched, almost screaming voice, yelled out Michael's name. It was like he was directly yelling to Michael a clear and desperate plea. I need you, Michael, to help me. Now, at this point, obviously, the situation has escalated dramatically. Things were already bad, but for Michael, this felt like a huge deal. I mean, before that, all the yelling and screaming was obviously terrible, but Michael, he kind of views himself as Grant's potential successor. He's going to be the next president of this fellowship. And he looked up to Grant so much, primarily because Grant was this fearless, capable leader. And so Michael sort of felt like when he heard his own name called out so clearly that Grant was specifically sort of challenging him. You, Michael, I need you. Michael took on that responsibility in that instant. And he felt like, I can't just sit here. I can't just wait for help to arrive. Something needs to be done right now, and I need to be the one to do it. I need to save Grant. And so Michael, he jumped up and he grabbed the extra harness they still had with them and he started to put it on. And as he was doing that, he could hear Carrie, who, she's seeing what's happening and she's telling him, don't do it. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know how to go down this thing. Like, this is dangerous. What are you doing? Don't go. And Michael, he just looked at her and he said, I have to do this. I know Grant would do this for me. I'm doing it for him. He needs me. I'm going down. And Michael, he's listening to Carrie, who is still trying to tell him not to go, but he just said to her, please pray for me. And then he walked over to the edge of the pit and he attached his harness to the very same rope that Grant presumably was still attached to somewhere down at the bottom, but stuck for some reason. And into the pit he went. As soon as Michael disappeared down into that hole, Carrie knelt down beside the pit. She put her hands together and she prayed as hard as she possibly could for both Michael and Grant to be okay. And after a few minutes, she heard Michael call out from somewhere in the hole. And for some reason, she could actually understand what Michael was saying. He called out that he and Grant were okay. He was with Grant, but they were just very, very cold. Relief flooded over Carrie. And as she exhaled all the tension she'd been holding in her body, and as the adrenaline kind of began to leave her system because now she's thinking everything is okay, she also realized that she too was very cold. She just hadn't been thinking about it before. She had been so fixated on the safety of her boyfriend and also of Michael. After all, she was only wearing a t-shirt and the cave was very damp and there's this waterfall constantly spraying a mist of cold water everywhere. It was a cold, damp environment. And so her teeth are chattering too. She's cold. And so Carrie naturally yelled down into this hole. She can't see them, of course. She's just yelling into the darkness, what's going on? What's wrong? Is Grant okay? But Michael just shouted back to her, I'm fine. I'm fine. But he didn't answer her question about Grant. And at this, Carrie could tell that clearly there is something really wrong down there, and it probably has something to do with Grant. And so she stood up. She began pacing back and forth anxiously. Her stomach is in knots. And she's periodically yelling down into the hole to Michael, like, what's going on? Is Grant okay? Are you okay? But Michael, all he would say back to her is, I'm fine. I'm fine. He would just repeat that back to her. But his response time began to slow down. He wasn't responding to each and every one of her calls. He would just, occasionally yell out, I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. But the responses just began to become more and more spaced out as Carrie began to ramp up her questioning, asking more and more, what's going on? Until finally, Michael just stopped answering altogether. There were no more voices coming out of the hole. And so, the minutes ticked by, and Carrie, she continued to pace around the edge of the pit, yelling out to Michael and Grant. But the only reply she got was the sound of the water from the waterfall lapping up against the cold cave walls. About an hour and a half later, just before 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a man named Anmar Mirza, along with 2 other men, ran into Ellison Cave, carrying a large bag filled with climbing equipment and medical supplies. Now, there was a bigger team of professional rescue workers on their way up the mountain behind them. That team had more gear and more personnel, but that group was moving much more slowly. It takes time to respond to a cave accident, because typically there are a lot of people and a lot of specialized equipment that is required. And also, usually, the victims are trapped in pretty remote and difficult to access places, like deep tunnels and narrow shafts deep inside of these caves. So Anmar and his 2-man team were the initial smaller group that went in ahead of the larger one, just to kind of get the rescue started as quickly as possible. A few minutes after entering the cave, Anmar saw a headlamp beam up ahead in the darkness, kind of bobbing around erratically. And as soon as he reached the origin of this light, he found a young woman. She was sitting by a large hole in the ground, and she was shaking and absolutely terrified. She explained that her name was Carrie, and that her boyfriend, whose name was Grant, along with one of his friends, whose name was Michael, were down in this hole. She told him that Grant had gone in first, there had been some kind of issue, and then Michael had gone in after him to help. And now, when she called out for them, neither one of them were responding. After hearing this, Anmar directed one of his team members to take Carrie and bring her safely out of the cave. And then, once they had left, Anmar put on his own climbing gear. And as soon as he was ready, he began to rappel down into the pit. As Anmar rappelled, he's looking straight down into this dark shaft. And at first, he can't see anything at all. But after a little while, he began to see, somewhere far down below, what appeared to be 2 small lights towards the bottom of the pit, which he correctly assumed belonged to the 2 missing men. But before he could actually reach them, he felt something wet and freezing cold splash against his cheek. Then he saw something emerge out of the darkness, right below him. It would turn out, when Grant had rappelled down into the warm-up pit, he had made a terrible, terrible mistake. He had attached his rigging, his main rope, to a section of rock that was directly in the path of a freezing cold waterfall. Now, this alone could have been okay. You can rappel effectively through a waterfall if you're careful and you move quickly. Except what happened with Grant is as he was rappelling literally through the flowing water, like the water is coming off this waterfall and it's hitting him directly, he got stuck. His rope got tangled, and the spot where he got stuck was literally in the direct path of the waterfall. So he's stuck in the cave. He can't go up. He can't go down. And he's just getting pounded by a constant stream of freezing cold water. Now, at first, what Grant likely did is kind of flail around trying desperately to get out of the path of this water, but there was nowhere to go. He's in this narrow vertical shaft. There's nowhere to move, and he's just dangling there. And he began trying to scream out for help. But that was why his words were so muffled. The water was hitting him in the face, making it impossible for him to speak clearly. And then also, as he's just dangling there very, very quickly, having that icy water hitting him nonstop would have sent his body into shock. It's like he wouldn't have been able to speak or even think anymore. He was rapidly becoming hypothermic. And then, in what was possibly one of his final moments of clarity, he managed to belt out Michael's name. He said it really clearly. He must have managed to get his face out of the direct path of the water for just a second. And Michael, who trusted Grant completely, when he heard his name being called, it felt like it was his personal calling. He felt he needed to go in there and save Grant himself. And so, into the hole he went. And he hooked his own rope up into the same exact spot that Grant had used. And down he went. And Michael, he did an incredibly brave thing by doing this. And it was something that Grant very likely would have done for him too. But again, Michael really had no idea what he was doing. He was basically just going in blind. However, unfortunately, because he just kind of followed Grant's lead and went down there without a plan, well, in the darkness, as he went down, he eventually reached the spot where Grant was, but he got stuck as well. Also, in the path of the waterfall. Granted, he was not nearly as exposed to the water as Grant was. Like his face was not getting blasted by water, so he was able to call out and be heard by Carrie at least for a little while. But he also got tangled at the same spot. He couldn't move. His body was getting hit by this icy water. And so even though the rescuers did eventually get down to Michael and Grant, by the time they did, it was too late. The two young men had frozen to death. They had basically dangled inside of that hole, getting hit by that freezing water for about 2 hours before their bodies just completely shut down. In 2013, 2 years after both Michael and Grant died inside of that cave, the Carnegie Hero Fund Commission gave Michael a posthumous medal for risking his own life in an attempt to save Grant's. On a Friday night in late March of 1980, an 83-year-old man named Harry R. Truman sat on his couch in his remote Washington State lodge. He had a glass of whiskey and Coke in his hand, and he turned on his battery-operated radio to listen to the news. Just a second or two later, he found himself having to jack up the volume on the radio because he couldn't hear it anymore. A couple of his cats were fighting in the other room, yowling and hissing, and it was causing a whole commotion. Harry had lost track of how many cats he actually had living with him, but it was a lot. Maybe a dozen or so. And even though at this particular moment he yelled and cursed at them and told them to knock it off, he was actually glad they were out there with him. He liked their company. 5 years earlier, Harry's beloved wife Edna had died. And ever since then, he had lived completely alone, minus all of these cats. And he also didn't have a lot of neighbors to speak of either. So, for the most part, he had been fairly isolated for the last few years. Also, Spirit Lake, the beautiful lake that his lodge was situated on, was a 4-hour drive south of the major city of Seattle. It was pretty far out there, deep in the wilderness. The lake did get busy during the summer months with tourists and campers, but at this time in March, there were only about 60 people that lived there year-round, and they were all very spread out. But Harry didn't really mind the solitude. He missed Edna a lot, of course, but he had his cats, and he had his radio, and he had the jaw-dropping mountain scenery and the lake right outside his door. And he had his whiskey and cokes. So overall, even though he was sort of a gruff, cantankerous guy, he was actually quite happy with his life. But just then, there was a loud knock on Harry's front door. And Harry was not surprised by this. I mean, yes, he lived way out in the middle of nowhere, and he did not normally expect visitors, but in this case, he knew exactly who it was. And as soon as he thought about that, his face contorted into a deep scowl. He was really annoyed. At this point in Harry's life, he really only had one problem. And it was a major problem, at least to him. And that was the government. For the last few days, government agents, like almost certainly the ones that were knocking on his door right now, had been harassing him. They were trying to get him to leave his lodge, to abandon the home in the wilderness that he loved so much. They said they needed to conduct some kind of federal operation, and they wanted everybody in the area to clear out. Now, Harry loved his country. He had even fought for it during the First World War. But he really did not like authority, and he could not tolerate being told what to do. During Prohibition, for example, which was a period of time in the 1920s when alcohol was illegal in America, Harry had simply ignored the law completely and made his own booze. He just didn't care about their rules. So, over these last few days, as these federal agents had come to his house trying to get him to leave, Harry had not been intimidated in the slightest. He had simply stood his ground. And he figured it was really only a matter of time before the federal government sent a local police officer over in the hopes that Harry would be more cooperative with somebody that he likely already knew. But what they didn't know about Harry is that Harry really didn't cooperate with anybody. Not with the government, and certainly not with local police. Not with his own family, not with his friends, and not with the 2 ex-wives he'd been with before he found Edna. He was just somebody who marched to the beat of his own drum. Always. So now, Harry did not get up to answer the knock at his door. Instead, he just waited until the person out there, the visitor, yelled through the door and announced who they were. And not really to Harry's surprise, it was the local deputy, a man that Harry did know. He was clearly being sent here by the federal agents to try one more time to get Harry to leave. And when Harry still didn't answer the door, even after the deputy had clearly announced himself knowing that Harry would recognize his voice, when Harry still didn't get up, didn't answer the door, the deputy finally, just sort of frustrated, called out, "Harry, are you sure you don't want to go?" Now, even though this deputy was being a whole lot more amicable than the government agents had been, they had been really forceful, basically telling him, "You've got to leave." The deputy here was at least kind of giving Harry a chance to make a decision for himself. Despite that, the question the deputy had asked just made Harry really mad. Because leaving his house was just not something he would ever consider doing. Harry had lived in this lodge for 54 years. And 37 of those years were spent running this lodge as an inn, as a business, with his late wife Edna, who was the love of his life. Now, he'd let the lodge go a little bit after she had died. So truthfully, it was kind of falling apart, and it smelled terrible because of all the cats. But it had been theirs, and now it was his, and he would never give it up. And not only that, but just outside his doorstep was Spirit Lake, which Harry believed was the most beautiful, perfect place in the entire world. It was quiet and serene and situated right at the base of some of the most breathtaking mountains he had ever seen in his whole life. And so to say Harry loved it here was a complete and total understatement. His lodge and Spirit Lake were basically his whole identity. Harry didn't know if he believed in God, but he did believe in the trees and the lake and the birds that screeched at him at all hours of the day. It was like his home, this whole area, was his religion. And he certainly was not about to give it up just because some federal authority or government agent or whoever else told him to. So all Harry said to the deputy waiting outside his door was a very firm good night, which Harry was actually quite proud of himself for because he had a really hard time not swearing. So this seemed pretty mild for him. After that, Harry waited to see if the deputy would challenge him or say anything else, but he didn't. And moments later, Harry heard the deputy's footsteps crunching down the gravel driveway and heading back towards his police cruiser. After that, Harry leaned back into his couch and smiled to himself. He picked up his drink, kind of toasting himself for standing his ground. And at the same time, he was sort of hoping that maybe now, finally, the officials would understand that he was not going to change his mind. But that's not what happened. A little more than a week later, on the morning of April 5th, Harry sat in a folding chair in a clearing by his house. He had his binoculars pressed to his eyes and a fresh glass of whiskey sitting in the cup holder of his chair. This was an area of the woods near his house that he called his cocktail lounge, where he'd often go to relax with a drink. It was covered by a thick canopy of evergreen trees, but it also had a great view of the mountains and the lake. But Harry was not here to relax. He was actually on very high alert, because the woods all around him were absolutely crawling with federal agents and local law enforcement officers. Harry could literally see them right now through his binoculars, walking around the various camps they had set up all over the mountainside and also down near the lake. And there was nobody to stop them, because everybody else who lived in this forest had bowed to the pressure and had left when they were told to. Which meant that Harry was quite literally the last resident still fighting the good fight. Now, so far, the officials had not physically attempted to force him out of his home, but now that Harry saw them all assembling all over the mountainside, he had to wonder how long he had before they did try. But at the same time, he also knew that he had one piece of very important and very surprising leverage over the authorities. And that was that over the past couple of days, Harry's stubborn refusal to leave his wilderness home, just because the government told him to, had turned him into a media attraction. Reporters had heard about what was going on, and they had started coming all the way out to his house to talk to him. Now, usually, Harry just did not like the press. Even though he clearly listened to the news himself, he still thought of the press, thought of the media like they were vultures, always just looking for dead meat and chaos. But Harry also really, really liked to talk, and he had a lot of very strong opinions. And now, seeing his beautiful lake inundated by all these outsiders, Harry realized he had to take full advantage of this media interest in him if he wanted to have any chance of staying in his home. Because the way he saw it was, the government could not really make him do anything against his will if the whole world was watching. So, over the next month, Harry gave a lot of interviews. And pretty quickly, he became kind of an international celebrity. He was this single, older man standing up to something way bigger and way more powerful than himself, which was sort of admirable. Although people didn't really understand why he was doing it, it was still a big story. It was very interesting. But more than that, it seemed like the public just sort of liked Harry. In his interviews, Harry would swear and yell and rant and rave and tell reporters about how no authority figure would dare try to get him out of his house. He famously said, "No, I'm not going to leave. You're damn right I'm not going to leave. I'm going to stay here. Damn right this is my home. They're going to have to come and get me. No authority could take me out of here. No authority dare." And he'd also talk about his life, just telling these crazy stories that had nothing to do with the wilderness, like about the whiskey that he bottled and distilled himself during his Prohibition days, which he called panthropy, and about his relationship with his late wife Edna and how they used to dance together right at the edge of the lake. Or his war stories from World War I. I mean, this guy was just really quite fascinating. And so, by the time May rolled around that year, Harry went from being bombarded by the government to being bombarded by the media. Today, this would be like going crazy viral, where everybody's seeing you on their feed. But this was 1980, and so people got their news from newspapers and the television and the radio. But those mediums were all full of Harry Truman, and people were kind of obsessed. Everybody from average citizens to school kids sent Harry fan mail. Reporters and news crews came to Harry's in droves, and some even took helicopters just to get there more quickly. And Harry, if he was being honest with himself, he sort of relished all the attention. A few months earlier, he'd been perfectly happy with his quiet life. He had no phone, and he just had his 1,000 cats for company. But now, it was like the whole world cared about him, and it was pretty cool. A few weeks later, though, everything changed. On Sunday, May 18th, the sun came up on Harry's lodge, and the woods around it were totally quiet for the first time in weeks. Because Harry, in some ways, had won. He had kept his word, and he'd stayed strong, and refused to give in to the government's demands to leave. And finally, the government had backed down. The sheriff had even come by the day before to tell Harry that, okay, no one's going to come by and ask you to leave anymore. It's on you. And so now, on May 18th, as Harry was getting up, it was just him, the lake, the trees, and the big, beautiful mountain. And then, at 8:32 in the morning, a deafening boom shook the earth. It would turn out the media was not totally finished with the story of Harry R. Truman. In fact, what happened on the morning of May 18th, 1980, would in many ways make Harry even more famous than he already was. Because Harry didn't live at the base of just any old mountain. His lodge was situated directly at the foot of Mount St. Helens, which was an active volcano. The government operation that the federal agents and local law enforcement were trying to run here was an evacuation. They were not trying to impede on Harry's rights as a citizen. They were trying to save his life. But Harry was so convinced that the land he loved so much, the land that he had lived on for nearly 60 years, would not hurt him. And so he ignored the authorities' repeated and urgent warnings. But Harry's decision was the wrong one. And on May 18th, he paid for his mistake. Because that morning, Mount St. Helens erupted, sending an avalanche of searing hot lava and mud directly onto Spirit Lake and Harry's lodge, killing him and all of his cats instantly. His remains were never found. 57 people died during this eruption, including Harry. Today, in that area, Harry has both a trail and a ridge that are named after him. So, in a way, he remains a part of the mountain that he loved so much. And in both of today's stories, the people at the center of them made choices they believed were the right ones. Grant believed he could handle the cave. Michael believed he could save his friend. Harry believed the mountain he loved would never harm him. But sometimes, confidence, loyalty, and even love can push people toward decisions they never fully realize are dangerous until it's far too late. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know which story stayed with you the most in the comments below. And if you want more true stories about strange disasters, impossible decisions, and people who found themselves in situations far beyond their control, we have an entire playlist waiting for you right now. Until next time, see ya. Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, is small and quiet. It is 15 miles east of Vancouver, near the Fraser River. The ground is saturated with mud in winter due to wet, cold, and gray weather. This is where Robert Picton was born in 1949. Robert, his brother and sister, lived in a remote and unusual environment. Their parents, Leonard and Louise Picton, ran a huge pig farm. Life was hard, dirty, and demanding. Locals thought the parents were eccentric, detached from the community, and indifferent to hygiene, but they were hardworking. They spent most of their waking hours working the muddy land, raising hundreds of pigs, and raising their children in a strange environment. Young Robert and his siblings were expected to work on the farm. Long hours in the dirt, animal slaughter, and strict, harsh parental rule characterized their lives. Robert was a strange, quiet child. He was teased at school for smelling like a farm and having mud and animal waste on his clothes. He became isolated and socially awkward as he struggled to fit in. Though eccentric, his brother was more outgoing, while their sister tried to distance herself from the family business as she aged. Over the years, the family ran the pig farm in relative isolation from the growing town. However, both parents died in the late 1970s. A turning point for the siblings. The three children received the entire large, valuable property. The sister immediately rejected the hard, dirty life of a pig farm. She packed up her belongings, sold her property share to her brothers, and moved as far as possible to start over. This left Robert and his brother to run the farm alone. They now ran the family business. The problem was that neither Robert nor his brother wanted to or could manage a business this size. The pig farm was managed for a few decades, but they soon gave up. Long, slow decline began at the farm. Rusted machinery, old cars, and trash made it an eyesore in the community. The pigs were still free to roam the property, digging through garbage, according to neighbors and visitors. The brothers and farm seemed to decline together. They appeared to have stopped bathing to anyone who met them. After walking through thick mud and pig feces all day, they never took off their heavy leather boots inside their living quarters. They would walk from the filthy pens to their trailers, dragging waste. They were always dirty, their clothes were stiff, and they smelled like manure and decay, so people avoided them in public. Some farm workers stayed with the Pictons as the farm declined, despite the poor conditions. These workers included Bill Hiscox. Bill spent many hours on the property doing odd jobs and caring for the animals. He later described the farm as creepy and unsettling, especially at night when shadows covered the dilapidated barns. He said Robert Picton was creepy and prone to bizarre, unpredictable behavior. This was even stranger because Robert never smoked, drank, or used illegal drugs. Although sober, he often fell into strange trances, mumbled to himself, and reacted to normal situations in ways that made everyone around him uncomfortable. The Picton brothers realized they were not suited to run the pig farm like their family had for generations. The business was losing money, the property was falling apart, and they were exhausted from physical labor. Their best option was to sell some of their land for quick cash. But neither could have predicted the value of their land. From 1994 to 1995, the brothers sold most of their property to an urban developer. Because Port Coquitlam was growing rapidly and expanding outward, developers needed lots of land to build new homes and businesses. The brothers sold their land for over $5 million. These filthy, failed pig farmers in squalor became multimillionaires overnight. They had no idea what to do with that money. They had millions in the bank after living in the mud their whole lives. For a year, they sat on the money and did little with it, living in rundown trailers on the small portion of the farm they kept. However, they decided to use their wealth for good, or at least appear to. The Piggy Palace Good Times Society was registered as a charity in 1996. The charity held dances, shows, and concerts to raise money for community organizations, sports teams, and needy families, according to their government paperwork. Despite their good intentions, the charity turned out differently. The brothers used it to throw wild, drug, and alcohol-fueled parties. They held these parties in their old slaughterhouse, a large metal and wood building on the property. Even though the slaughterhouse was no longer used for pig farming, big iron hooks hung from the wooden ceiling, and dark, old bloodstains covered the concrete ground underneath them. The Piggy Palace parties became notorious in Coquitlam. Large crowds of up to 2,000 people would attend. Many bikers, gang members, drug addicts, and sex workers from Vancouver's impoverished downtown east side attended. Drugs flowed freely, loud music played all night, and bonfires burned in the yard. Because the property was private and off the main roads, police rarely intervened. Robert Picton was well versed in that impoverished Vancouver neighborhood. He regularly drove his truck through there to dispose of animal waste at a rendering plant for years. He saw vulnerable street people on those trips. Robert frequented that neighborhood after the Piggy Palace charity began. He slowly cruised the Low Track, a 10-block downtown east side strip known to locals. The streets were full of sex workers trying to survive. Robert drove up and tried to get people to come to his farm for parties. Most of his recruits were impoverished women with severe drug addictions. They agreed to ride in his truck because he offered free food, cash, hard drugs, and unlimited alcohol. They saw a trip to the farm as a temporary escape from the harsh, cold streets, a place to get a warm meal and money without worrying about the city's dangers. At the same time Robert was recruiting, downtown Eastside women disappeared in droves. A woman could walk her corner one week and disappear the next. Downtown Eastside residents and workers noticed these disappearances immediately. They tracked each other and knew when someone disappeared. Unfortunately, they did not report these disappearances to authorities. Police and authority figures were deeply distrusted by the street community. They kept their worries to themselves and looked out for each other because they felt the police didn't care. But as more women disappeared from downtown Eastside, rumors of a serial killer spread. Fear was palpable. Residents altered their behavior. All were on edge and would only go outside if they could walk in a large group. They kept an eye out for suspicious people or slow-moving cars in the neighborhood. Despite this precaution, women disappeared rapidly and nobody knew why or where. The police responded poorly when family members and advocates contacted them about these missing women. No crime scenes or bodies were found, so police told the families to assume the women were responsible for their absences. They suggested that their high-risk lifestyles had caught up with them and that they had either fled to another city to start over or overdosed in a hidden alleyway and was still missing. The police refused to intervene despite downtown Eastside residents' pleas that this was different, that these women would never abandon their children or belongings, and that something was seriously wrong. They did not investigate the cases as homicides, viewing them as missing people who would likely be found. This apathetic police response prompted local newspapers to heavily criticize the department. They accused the police of intentionally deprioritizing these missing women because most were drug addicts and sex workers, suggesting they were not worth a full, expensive investigation. The police denied this claim, insisting they were following standard procedures, but tensions between the community and the police increased as the list of missing women grew. Tuesday night, the 22nd of March 1997, things changed drastically. 1 year had passed since the Piggy Palace Good Time Society was founded, and massive parties began, and dozens of women had disappeared from downtown Eastside. The Pictons' closest neighbor was inside their house when they heard a frantic, heavy knock on their front door one night. A neighbor rushed over and opened it. What they saw on their porch shocked them. In agony, a woman stood with one hand on her bleeding stomach. One metallic handcuff hung from her other wrist. The sight horrified the neighbor, but they acted quickly. They took the bleeding woman inside, locked the door, and called an ambulance. The woman was rushed to the hospital under emergency lights and prepped for emergency surgery to save her life from a deep abdominal stab wound. She chatted with her nurses in the recovery ward after the anesthesia wore off. She introduced herself as Wendy. She said she attended a Picton farm party. While she was there, farm owner Robert Picton lured her into his trailer. After entering, he tried to handcuff her wrist. Wendy immediately sensed danger and fought back, refusing to let him get the second cuff. Robert stabbed her in the stomach with a large knife during the fight. Wendy reclaimed the knife despite the excruciating pain and blood loss. She swung it at his face, stabbing him in cheek and nose. Wendy fled out the trailer door into the cold night while Robert was reeling from the blow. She ran through the mud, slipping and sliding to the neighbor's house. After Wendy told the nurses this terrifying story, something amazing happened. Robert Picton visited the same hospital. He sought emergency room treatment for a serious facial laceration. Stabbing was confirmed by the wound. After hearing Wendy's story, the medical staff recognized him and called the police. Officers arrived at the hospital minutes later. Robert was in the treatment room when they found a metal handcuff key in his pockets. They tested that key on Wendy's handcuff. The key turned, opening the handcuff. With this physical evidence, police arrested Robert Picton for attempted murder immediately. It appeared the case was closed. However, Robert met with investigators and gave his account while in custody. He informed the officers that Wendy lied. He said she was a drug addict who had come to the farm for a party and tried to rob him in his trailer. Robert said she became violent and drew a knife when he confronted her about the theft. He said they fought and were stabbed as he tried to defend himself. Robert looked the officers in the eye and said he was lucky to survive. Amazingly, the police believed Robert's story over Wendy's. Due to her lifestyle and addiction, they considered Wendy unreliable. Because of this bias, they dropped all charges against Robert and released him. He left the police station and returned to his farm, acquitted. The only worker on the property, Bill Hiscox, was suspicious when Robert returned. Bill read all the downtown East Side missing women news. He knew Robert frequently went there to pick up women and had seen many of them return to the farm for parties. Bill had always felt something was off about Robert, and this hospital incident with Wendy confirmed his worst fears. Bill sat on this gut feeling for 2 months, growing uneasy in his farm chores every day. He finally realized he had to share. He called Crime Stoppers. He told the operator that Robert had attacked Wendy, not the other way around, and that Robert was likely responsible for some or all of the downtown East Side women's disappearances. Bill provided more crucial evidence to support his claim. He told the police that Lisa, a recent farm guest, saw something disturbing in Robert's trailer. Lisa had noticed a messy pile of women's clothes, at least 10 purses, and women's ID cards. The police investigated this tip. They asked Lisa to confirm what she saw in the trailer. However, Lisa was terrified of Robert when they spoke. She refused to cooperate with the investigation or sign a statement because she knew his abilities. The police said they didn't have probable cause to search Robert's trailer or farm without her testimony. Instead of digging deeper, they closed the file and moved on to other cases, leaving Robert to his daily routine. In subsequent years, the Pictons held massive, chaotic Piggy Palace parties. While they brought hundreds of vulnerable people to the farm, dozens more downtown East Side women disappeared without police investigation. This happened despite Bill Hiscox calling the police constantly, pleading for Robert Picton's investigation, and claiming he was responsible for the missing women. His calls were ignored by the police as annoying and obsessive. Fast forward to 2002. A former Picton farm employee who had a fight with Robert reported him to the police. He claimed to have seen a cache of illegal, unlicensed weapons in Robert's trailer on the property. Canadian police took weapons charges seriously, and this direct information about illegal firearms was enough to get a search warrant. They got the warrant to find illegal guns, not missing women. In February 2002, a large police task force raided the pig farm. The property was swarmed, secured, and Robert's messy trailer searched. They easily found the illegal guns, as the informant described inside. However, as they searched the cluttered rooms, they found several items linked to downtown East Side missing women. Identification cards, personal items, and clothing were found. Robert was arrested for weapons, but the legal system got him out on bail. However, the police knew they were onto something bigger. They kept Robert under close physical surveillance and forbade him from returning to the farm until they finished a thorough forensic search of the entire acreage. With specialized chemical sprays, forensic investigators searched Robert's trailer for blood during this massive, detailed farm search. Chemicals reacted in one room, revealing a lot of blood. The blood sample matched one of the downtown East Side missing women after DNA testing. With this forensic evidence of foul play, police acted immediately. After being arrested, Robert Picton was charged with murder. While Robert was in a secure jail cell awaiting trial, the police conducted a clever undercover operation. They imprisoned another man. Robert thought this man was another serious crime detainee waiting for his trial. Actually, this man was an experienced undercover police officer, and the entire cell was wired with hidden microphones and video cameras to record every word. During their time in the small cell, Robert relaxed. He brags to the undercover officer about his dark secrets. Robert made shocking statements in these recorded conversations. He calmly confessed to his cellmate that he killed 49 people. He said these victims were most of the downtown East Side's missing women over the past decade. He even complained to the undercover officer that he had wanted 50 victims but got caught because he was sloppy at the end. The horrific timeline and methods of Robert's killing spree were revealed after a massive years-long investigation. After this confession, he started killing women in 1991. In 1996, he and his brother founded the Piggy Palace Good Time Society, which boosted his business. Parties were ideal hunting grounds. Robert used these large, crowded gatherings to lure his victims to his farm faster and less suspiciously. After a victim arrived on his farm, he led them away from the party and into his trailer. He would quickly trap, handcuff, and tell them it was over once inside. He would then execute them. His methods were cold and calculated. He would inject them with deadly automotive antifreeze or strangle them to death, making them silent. Robert waited until the farm was quiet and the partygoers left after the victim died. He moved the body from his trailer to the bloody slaughterhouse. He butchered humans like pigs using their farming equipment. He had a well-organized and disturbing corpse disposal system. The hungry pigs on the property ate a lot of his victims' body parts. Pigs ate almost everything, leaving little trace. Robert had an even more shocking disposal method for body parts he didn't feed to his pigs. He drove the remains to the downtown East Side rendering plant in barrels. This was the plant he had visited for years, just blocks from where he picked up the women. An industrial rendering plant crushes and cooks animal waste, carcasses, fat, and bone at high temperatures. Waste becomes refined gelatin. This gelatin is sold as a raw material and used to make cosmetics, lipsticks, gummy candy, and marshmallows. This meant that Robert's victims' microscopic remains ended up in consumer products sold to unsuspecting Americans. The horror continued. Robert sometimes saved the best human meat during the grueling butchering and disposal process. He ground this meat in his commercial grinders and mixed it with pork. He seasoned and made sausage. Robert served this homemade sausage to his massive Piggy Palace party guests. He casually gave packages of the meat to unsuspecting neighbors and donated boxes of sausage to local food banks and orphanages. People ate this meat without knowing its horrific origin. One of Canada's largest and most expensive forensic investigations was the Picton Farm search for physical evidence. Investigators in protective suits and masks spent months carefully sifting through over 300,000 cubic meters of soil and pig feces beneath the farm. To find tiny bone and dental fragments, they had to screen every bucket of dirt. Robert's highly effective body disposal methods made the search difficult. Investigators found only small pieces of 26 missing women's remains despite their massive efforts. After reviewing this physical evidence, the prosecution charged Robert Picton with 26 first-degree murders. However, the judge split the trial into two parts due to its complexity and amount of evidence. The first trial would focus on 6 cases with the strongest physical evidence. The jury heard weeks of horrific testimony about the farm, undercover jailhouse recordings, and forensic findings. The jury convicted Robert Picton of all 6 second-degree murder charges. Since he was convicted on these 6 counts and received the maximum sentence, the prosecution decided not to run the second trial for the remaining 20 counts, saving taxpayers millions of dollars. The harshest Canadian sentence at the time was life in prison without parole for 25 years for Robert Picton. He remains in prison, isolated. His brother and sister owned the land, and his brother ran the Piggy Palace Good Time Society and parties, but they were never charged with murder. No direct evidence showed that the siblings knew about Robert's horrific trailer and slaughterhouse crimes, investigators said. The case left a lasting mark on Port Coquitlam and downtown Eastside Vancouver. The victims' families struggled with grief and anger. They warned the police for years that a predator was targeting their daughters, sisters, and mothers, but they were ignored. Instead of dropping charges, the police could have saved dozens of lives by investigating Wendy's 1997 attack or the disappearances. The remaining 23 families whose loved ones were never tried, and the dozens of other families of missing women who suspect Robert of their disappearances, but whose remains were never recovered from the pig farm, still remain. They remain haunted by the details of what happened to the women they loved. The Piggy Palace story is a grim reminder of what happens when those sworn to protect them forget the most vulnerable. We must look back at the years before Robert's arrest, when authorities ignored multiple red flags, to understand how this tragedy could have been prevented. From initial reports of missing women to survivors' physical evidence, the system failed almost everywhere. Because of their struggles, downtown Eastside residents were silenced while a killer operated publicly on a quiet farm 15 miles away. The farm showed how easy it was to hide a dark secret if no one was looking. The massive, isolated property was surrounded by thick trees and overgrowth. It appeared to passers-by as a failing agricultural operation where time had stopped while the city modernized. The brothers lived in rusted trailers with junked cars, appliances, and scrap metal. This cluttered landscape made it easy to hide evidence, as unusual items or activities could be explained away as farm clutter. Additionally, the pig farm's nature provided a perfect cover for the horrific activities there. Pigs are opportunistic feeders that will eat almost anything, so the property's large number of animals made organic material easy to dispose of. The constant smell of manure and animal waste also masked other odors that might have alarmed neighbors or visitors. A self-contained disposal system allowed Robert to commit crimes for over a decade without local authorities noticing. The Piggy Palace Good Time Society was crucial to these events. A charity that hosted dances and community events became a hub for illegal activity, attracting hundreds of marginalized people. The parties were held in the old slaughterhouse, which killed and processed animals. Robert was able to operate in an environment where meat hooks, concrete drainage troughs, and bloodstains were common. The drugs, alcohol, and chaos at these parties often distracted guests from noticing anything unusual. They came to the farm to escape their problems and use drugs without fear of arrest. The women who disappeared were often last seen at these parties, surrounded by people who were too impaired to remember who they were with or when they left, creating a perfect storm of vulnerability. The complex relationship between the Vancouver Police Department and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Coquitlam Detachment hampered the disappearance investigation. The missing women disappeared from Vancouver, but the farm was in Port Coquitlam, so the case involved multiple jurisdictions. This prevented departments from communicating and coordinating, as each assumed the other was handling the situation. Information was lost, tips were not shared, and the investigation was uncoordinated until it was too late. A personal grievance-driven former employee provided the specific information about illegal weapons that allowed police to obtain a search warrant, turning the case around. The breakthrough was not from a dedicated homicide investigation, but from a routine firearms check, which is frustrating. Without that tip, the farm may never have been searched, and Robert Pickton may have continued his horrific activities for years. The post-raid farm forensic search was unprecedented. Every shovelful of soil was sifted through mesh screens after several feet of excavation. The largest forensic excavation in Canadian history took over a year and cost tens of millions of dollars. Anthropologists, entomologists, and DNA experts identified tiny human remains that survived the destruction process. The forensic team suffered greatly emotionally. They worked in mud, pig feces, and the property's grim reality for months. Since they found the missing women's jewelry, keys, and clothing, many workers needed counseling to cope with their discoveries. The items were a sad reminder of a life cut short and a tangible link to a loved one who had died. The legal proceedings were also complicated and tense. Much of the evidence was circumstantial or based on microscopic DNA fragments, making it difficult for the prosecution to present to a jury. To ensure a fair trial and prevent the jury from being overwhelmed, the charges were split, a controversial move that led to a conviction on the first 6 counts. The families of the other 20 women were frustrated by this decision because they felt their loved ones were not getting justice in a public courtroom. The small city of New Westminster hosted the trial, which garnered international media attention. Every day, journalists, legal experts, and victims' families filled the courtroom to learn how such a horrific series of crimes could have happened. The defense claimed Robert was a simple, easily manipulated man being scapegoated for others, but the forensic evidence and undercover recordings were insurmountable. The sentencing of Robert Pickton provided some closure, but also sparked a discussion about systemic failures and vulnerable populations. The British Columbia police response to missing women reports was heavily criticized by a public inquiry. Systemic bias, lack of resources, and poor communication contributed to the killer's escape, prompting calls for major reforms in missing persons cases. The Piggy Palace case still affects Canadian public policy and community activism. It stressed the need for better support for sex workers, drug users, and Indigenous women who are overrepresented among missing and murdered Canadians. Community groups in Vancouver's downtown east side continue to provide safe spaces, housing, and advocacy for those vulnerable to exploitation and violence. After reading this tragic story, we feel deeply for the victims and their families. Real people with dreams, struggles, and loving families. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends killed by a predator who exploited their vulnerability. The fight for justice, accountability, and social change ensures that their names are never forgotten and that such a tragedy never happens again. The Port Coquitlam farm has been cleared, the buildings demolished, and the land left vacant, but its history lives on. A dark, silent horror lurked behind a rural decay facade, reminding us that the most terrifying events can happen in the most unexpected places. The investigation's lessons shape forensic science and police procedures worldwide, serving as a grim example. Media coverage of the case is also debated. Initial coverage was sparse, reflecting societal indifference to the missing women. Only after family members, advocates, and a few dedicated journalists brought the story to national attention did the police and public face the truth. This media shift raised awareness and pressured authorities to act, showing the power of investigative journalism to expose systemic failures. Financial aspects of the case are also important. The brothers' sudden rise from failing farmers to millionaires shows how real estate development affects rural properties. The millions they made selling their land funded the destructive lifestyle and parties that allowed the crimes, not personal improvement. Tragically, their wealth enabled one of Canada's darkest chapters. Wendy, the farm escapee, is one of the most remarkable and terrifying parts of the story. She fought back, wounded her attacker, and escaped due to her bravery and quick thinking. It is tragic that her brave actions and clear testimony were not enough to secure justice at the time, but her survival and the evidence she provided helped bring the killer to justice. Her experience also exposes the justice system's deep flaws in treating non-perfect witnesses. The decision to dismiss her account based on her personal struggles highlights the prejudice vulnerable people face when seeking legal help. As advocacy groups advocate for a more compassionate, unbiased approach to supporting victims of violence, regardless of background or lifestyle, this lesson remains relevant. The undercover police officer who shared a cell with Robert helped convict him. To gain the trust of a suspected serial killer in a confined space requires immense psychological skill, and the operation recordings gave the jury direct, undeniable proof of Robert's guilt. His boastful confession in his own voice disproved any doubts about his involvement in the disappearances and revealed his cold, unfeeling crimes. His confession, especially his desire to kill 50 people, showed chilling calculation and remorse. He treated his victims like numbers in a grim tally, not people with lives and value. Hearing such offenders casually express their lack of empathy in the recordings was powerful and disturbing for everyone involved in the trial. The forensic search had a major environmental impact. To avoid contamination, hazardous waste and biohazards had to be managed during the excavation of such a large area. The site was secured, and specialized equipment processed soil and runoff water to ensure the search did not harm the local community. Environmental agencies, forensic experts, and local government collaborated on the massive logistical challenge. The pig farm site is now quiet and empty, a stark contrast to its past chaos and horror. Port Coquitlam residents see it as a haunting reminder of the community's loss of safety. Some want to build a memorial park to honor the victims, while others want to leave it as a quiet green space for nature to slowly reclaim the site of so much suffering. Annually, victims' families gather to remember and support each other. These rallies demonstrate the community's strength and resilience in refusing to let the killer's horrific actions define the women's memory. They celebrate their lives, personalities, and love to keep their spirits alive in a world that often forgot them. The case transformed evidence management, multi-jurisdictional investigations, and victim rights in Canada. Based on the systemic failures in Vancouver and Port Coquitlam, police training programs nationwide emphasize building trust with marginalized communities, taking missing persons reports seriously from the start, and preventing bias from impede justice. The entire story, from Robert Picton's quiet childhood on the isolated pig farm to the massive forensic search and dramatic courtroom trial, reminds us of justice's fragility and the importance of protecting the most vulnerable. This story asks us to examine our society, question how we value different lives, and make sure no one falls through the cracks of our collective care and protection. The memories of the 26 women whose remains were found and the many others still missing inspire action. Their stories demonstrate the human cost of indifference and the power of persistence against systemic obstacles. Daughters laughed, mothers cared, and sisters dreamed, and their lives had meaning and value that cannot be erased by death. While the case exposed deep divisions, the local community has worked to heal. New community policing initiatives and programs offer support to downtown Eastside residents to improve police-resident relations. Although there is still much to do, these initiatives are a step forward in ensuring that past mistakes are not repeated and that every community member is treated with dignity, respect, and care. The Piggy Palace Good Time Society's tragic tale of missed opportunities and deep grief is complex. However, it is also about survival, community, and truth-seeking. It reminds us that even in the face of unimaginable horror, there are always those who will fight for justice, speak for the voiceless, and bring the truth to light, no matter how long or difficult. As we close this chapter on one of the most disturbing cases in modern history, we carry the names and memories of the victims, the courage of the survivors, and the dedication of those who worked to bring a killer to justice. Their legacy inspires us to protect each other, fight injustice, and create a world where everyone is safe, valued, and remembered. Many thanks for watching. Comment your thoughts on today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you. Michael DiPolito grew up in a place that was tough by any standard. We're talking about a rough neighborhood in South Philadelphia. This was the kind of place where things like violence, drugs, and prostitution weren't shocking events you saw on the news. They were just part of the background noise of everyday life. And like a lot of kids in that environment, Michael got pulled into it early. His parents were alcoholics, and soon so was he. It didn't stop there. He developed a serious drug addiction, and to pay for it, he started selling drugs himself. School just wasn't a priority for him. He eventually dropped out of high school, and it wasn't long after that he found himself with nowhere to go. He became homeless, living out on the streets of the city he grew up in. At night, he'd find abandoned buildings to sleep in, just trying to stay warm and get through to the next day. In 1993, while he was still in this situation in South Philadelphia, the law caught up with him for the first time. He was arrested and charged with possession of an unknown drug, as well as the intent to sell it. The court records don't say what the drug was, but it didn't really matter. Michael was given a court date, and he just didn't show up. A warrant was put out for his arrest. Somehow, Michael managed to stay off the radar. He evaded the police for years. By 1997, he decided he needed a complete change of scenery. He fled South Philly and made his way down to South Florida, landing in a town called Boca Raton. But his old life had a way of following him. Shortly after he arrived, he was arrested for a second time. This time, he had offered an undercover police officer $15 in exchange for sex. He pleaded guilty to soliciting prostitution, but he was released not long after. A year after that arrest, his past came knocking again. A former girlfriend named Karen Tan sued him. She claimed he was the father of her son and that he owed her child support. Karen wasn't just making it up, she had a DNA test to prove it. But, just like with his drug charge, Michael simply didn't show up for court. After a while, Karen must have realized it was a losing battle, and she gave up and dropped the lawsuit. For Michael, this was probably a huge relief. At the time, he was working through a temp agency, making barely any money. He knew he couldn't afford child support. So after that lawsuit was dropped, Michael decided he needed to find a way to make some real money. And in his search for a better opportunity, he somehow crossed paths with associates of the Bonanno crime family. Now, the Bonanno family is one of the 5 infamous families that dominate organized crime in the United States. They are, quite literally, the Italian mafia. When they met Michael, they saw something in him. He was charismatic, a natural talker. They liked him. And they offered him a job, an illegal one, but a very lucrative one. They gave him a role inside one of their so-called boiler rooms. A boiler room isn't a literal room with a boiler. It's a place where a group of fraudsters work the phones using high-pressure sales tactics to steal money from people. The way it usually works is a fraudster will cold call someone, maybe an elderly person, and tell them about this incredible get-rich-quick investment opportunity. But they'd always say, you have to invest right now, or you'll miss out. When the unsuspecting victim agrees and wires over their money, the fraudster just keeps it. Michael turned out to be incredibly good at this. He was a natural salesman, and he could trick people into giving him their money with ease. And so, it didn't take long for him to realize he could make a lot more if he wasn't just an employee. He wanted to be the boss. He figured if he started his own boiler room, his commission on the money he stole could be much, much higher. So, pretty abruptly, he left the mafia's operation. We don't really know how the Bonanno family reacted to one of their guys just up and leaving to start a competing scam. Michael went on to set up not 1, but 2 of his own boiler room scams right there in South Florida. By 2002, he had managed to steal $155,000, but he had spent almost all of it. He lived a lavish lifestyle of fancy hotels, expensive cars, and phone sex lines. The good times, however, were not going to last. In 2002, the police finally caught on to Michael's scams. They raided both of his boiler rooms, and Michael was arrested for a 3rd time. And this time, he didn't skip his court date. He stood trial, was found guilty, and was sentenced to 2 years in prison and an incredible 28 years of probation. He was also ordered to pay back every single cent of the $155,000 he had stolen. Michael would only end up serving 7 months of his 2-year sentence, but those 7 months changed him forever. He absolutely hated prison. He hated every single second of it. During the long, sleepless nights he spent lying awake in his cell, he made a promise to himself. He swore that when he got out, when he was finally released, he would never, ever come back. And so, when he was released in 2003, he was a man on a mission. The first thing he did was enter a sobriety program. He started going to the gym every single morning, getting his body and mind right. He also started studying for his GED. That's a high school equivalency test because remember, he had never gotten his high school diploma. A couple of months later, he passed the test and earned his GED. Then, he started a legitimate business. It was a digital marketing firm he called Mad Money Inc. Over the next several years, Michael did his absolute best to stay on the straight and narrow. He focused on his sobriety, his health, and his business. And for the most part, he succeeded. By 2008, he was still sober, though he'd had a few setbacks along the way. His business, Mad Money Inc., was doing very well, earning him nearly $100,000 a year. But his personal life was about to get very messy. Michael had gotten married back in 2007 to his longtime girlfriend, Maria Luongo. Maria had stood by him through everything, including his time in jail. But that year, in 2008, Michael, who was now 38 years old, cheated on her. He met a 26-year-old real estate agent named Dalia Muhammad at a Starbucks. What was probably intended to be a quick, meaningless fling turned into something more. Michael and Dalia fell in love, and they fell hard. Once Michael knew his feelings were real, he went to his wife Maria and told her everything. He told her he was in love with someone else and he wanted a divorce. Just 3 days after the divorce was finalized, Michael and Dalia went down to the courthouse and got married. The newlyweds moved into a brand new condo that Michael had bought for them in Boynton Beach, a beautiful town in South Florida. And for a little while, their life seemed perfect. They knew the way they got together was outrageous, meeting and marrying so quickly, but they didn't care. They got along great and were excited to start their future together. But that perfect life was not going to last. On the evening of the 12th of March 2009, only about a month after they had gotten married, Michael and Dalia were at home in their condo. Suddenly, they heard a knock on the front door. Michael went to see who it was. He opened the door, and to his complete surprise, his probation officer was standing on his doorstep. And behind the probation officer was a whole group of police officers. Before Michael could even ask what was going on, his probation officer told him that they had received an anonymous phone call. The caller had tipped them off that Michael was selling steroids, ecstasy pills, and other drugs out of his condo. Michael was stunned. He told the probation officer there was no way that was true. He insisted he wasn't selling any drugs. He was sober. He wasn't involved in that life anymore. Eventually, seeing that they were serious, Michael just stepped aside. He said, "Please, come in. Search my condo. I have nothing to hide." So, that's what they did. The police came inside and searched the entire place. But just as Michael had said, they didn't find anything. And so, they left. After the police were gone, Michael and Dalia just stood there in their condo, completely dumbfounded. What just happened? Who would make a call like that? But instead of trying to figure it all out right then and there, they decided the best thing to do was just to get out of the condo for the night. They packed a couple of bags, left their home, which was a total mess from the police search, and went to stay at a nice hotel. They tried to put the strange event behind them and just have a nice night together. The next morning, they got up and headed down to the hotel parking lot. As they were walking toward their car, they saw a familiar sight. Standing around Michael's car was his probation officer, along with several other police officers. Michael and Dalia looked at each other in disbelief. What is going on? They rushed over to the car, and before they could even start pleading their innocence, Michael's probation officer held up a hand. He told Michael that they had received another anonymous call. This time, the caller said that Michael was selling drugs out of his vehicle, and they needed to search it. Michael was just beside himself. He couldn't believe this was happening again. But what could he do? He told them to go ahead and search the car. He said there was nothing in there. And so the police opened up his car and tore it apart, looking for anything illegal. And once again, they found nothing. Over the next couple of weeks, this was the only thing Michael and Dahlia could talk about. Who was making these anonymous calls? Why was someone claiming Michael was selling drugs from his condo and his car? It just didn't make any sense. They wanted to believe it was all just some big, crazy mistake, but in the back of their minds, they both knew about Michael's very checkered past. They thought about his dealings with the mafia and all the people he had ripped off in his boiler room scams. They started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, someone from his past was looking for revenge, trying to get him arrested and sent back to jail. Fast forward to March 29th. This was 17 days after that first raid on their condo. That night, Michael and Dahlia had been out to dinner at a restaurant. When they left and walked out to the parking lot, they were met with the same unbelievable scene. Standing around Michael's car were several police officers, clearly waiting for him. This time, they didn't even need to ask why the police were there. Michael and Dahlia walked over to them and just started pleading. They told the officers that this had to be a setup. They insisted they didn't have any drugs in the car. They begged the police to understand that someone was doing this to them. But this time, when the police searched his car, they would find something. After a thorough search of Michael's car, the police found a small bag of cocaine. It was stuck inside of a cigarette carton, which was tucked away underneath the spare tire in the trunk. When Michael saw the officer pull the bag of cocaine out, he just broke down. He started to cry. He knew, even though the drugs were not his, and even though he hadn't put them there, that he was going to jail. He was on probation. A possession charge would be a clear violation, and he would be sent right back to prison. He just stood there crying, pleading with the police, swearing that the cocaine was not his. Meanwhile, Dahlia was watching all of this unfold. And for a moment, she started to second-guess everything. Was Michael lying? Was he actually selling drugs and had been lying to her this whole time? But then she looked at her husband. He was crying hysterically, and he looked so sincere, so genuinely terrified. And in that moment, she decided she believed him. She was convinced he had to be telling the truth. So pretty soon, she was standing right there beside Michael, also pleading with the police. She told them to let him go, that this was obviously a setup. Amazingly, the police officers seemed to be listening. They were already aware of the two previous false tip-offs about Michael. They told Michael and Dahlia that they did think the situation was pretty suspicious. Someone keeps calling in about you selling drugs, and now, suddenly, drugs magically appear in your car. It seemed too convenient. So, the officers told them what they were going to do. They said they were going to confiscate the cocaine, but they were not going to arrest Michael. They told them to go home, be safe, and to call them immediately if they saw or heard anything strange. And they promised they would start an investigation to figure out who was making all of these anonymous calls. Michael and Dahlia were so relieved they could hardly believe it. But at the same time, they were also terrified. It was clear now that whoever was trying to get Michael in trouble was willing to break into his property to do it. What was stopping them from breaking into their condo and planting drugs there too? After the police left, Michael and Dahlia jumped in their car and sped back to their condo. They went inside and searched the entire place from top to bottom. They were looking for any sign that someone had recently been inside, or for any more drugs or anything else illegal that might have been planted. After a long search, they found nothing. So they locked all their doors, shut all their windows, closed all the blinds, and just prayed. They prayed that the police would be able to quickly find out who was doing this to them and make it stop. But over the next few months, the police didn't figure out who the anonymous caller was. And that was because the caller had stopped calling. The phone calls just ended. And for a little while, Michael and Dahlia started to believe that the whole terrifying ordeal was finally over. They slowly returned to their normal lives. But on the 5th of August 2009, roughly 4 months after the cocaine had been found in Michael's car, the anonymous caller would come back with a vengeance. On that morning, at around 5:45 a.m., Dahlia left the condo. Michael was still in bed, asleep. She headed out to her local gym to get a workout in. Around 6:30 inches the morning, she stepped off the treadmill and checked her phone. She saw she had a missed call from a number she didn't recognize. The number had also left her a voicemail. So she called her voicemail and put the phone to her ear. As she listened to the message, her heart started to race. It was a Boynton Beach detective. He was telling her that there had been some sort of incident at her condo and that she needed to come back right away. Terrified, Dahlia grabbed her things and ran out of the gym. She got into her car and immediately called the number back. When the detective picked up, she tried to get more information out of him. What kind of incident? What happened? But the detective would only say that it involved her husband, Michael, and that he would explain everything when she got back to the condo. In a total state of shock, Dahlia started her car, sped out of the parking lot, and headed home. When she turned onto her street and saw her condo, she slammed on the brakes. The entire area was a chaotic scene. In front of her condo were multiple police cars, their lights flashing. Police officers were walking all around the property. Yellow crime scene tape was stretched across the front of her home. And inside that taped-off area, there were crime scene photographers taking pictures of her condo. As Dahlia sat there in her car at the end of the street, just staring at this unbelievable scene, one of the Boynton Beach police officers saw her. He walked up to her car, and after confirming that she was Dahlia DiPolito, he told her to leave her car right where it was and to come with him. Dahlia knew, obviously, that something terrible had happened, but she still didn't know exactly what. She put her car in park, got out, and began walking with the police officer. He led her toward a small group of 3 people who were standing right in front of her property. It turned out one of them was the detective who had called her on the phone. As soon as that detective saw Dahlia approaching, he walked over to her. And then, very matter-of-factly, he told her that someone had called in a disturbance at their condo. He said that shots were fired, and unfortunately, her husband, Michael, was dead. Dahlia became totally hysterical. An officer gently led her away from the scene and into a nearby police car. They drove her to the police station, sat her down in an interrogation room, and began asking her questions about her husband. The detective said to her, "Look, I know you just found this out, but we have to figure out what happened. There's a killer on the loose, and we need to find this person and stop them." At first, the conversation was mostly just Dahlia crying while the detective tried to calm her down. But eventually, she started talking. She told the detective all about the anonymous caller who kept phoning the police and claiming Michael was selling drugs. She told him how she and Michael suspected that the caller was probably connected to someone from his past. Maybe someone from the mafia, or maybe one of the victims from his boiler room scams. She said it could be any number of people that Michael had wronged over the years. The detective took diligent notes, listening patiently to everything Dahlia said. Then, during a break in the conversation, he looked at her and said, "Okay, it's time to get serious. I need to know if you know this guy." Dahlia, who had been looking down at the table, looked up, confused about what he was talking about, and then the door to the interrogation room opened. A huge man in handcuffs walked into the room. An officer was yelling, "Come here! Bring this guy in here!" "Get over here." "Do you know who this guy is?" Dahlia looked at the man and said, "Never seen him before." The officer asked the man, "Do you know her?" The man looked at Dahlia. An officer said, "Put your head up and look at her." The man said, "I've never seen her before." The officer then asked him, "What were you doing coming out of her house?" Then he ordered for the man to be taken out of the room. It would turn out Dahlia was lying. She knew exactly who that man was. The truth was, almost immediately after marrying Michael 6 months earlier, she had stolen $200,000 from him. But apparently, that wasn't enough for her. She wanted the rest of his money, and she wanted his condo too. So, she had been the anonymous caller all along. She was the one who kept calling the police, tipping them off that Michael was selling drugs out of the condo and out of his car. She was the one who planted the bag of cocaine in the back of his car. She wanted him to get arrested because she knew that since he was on probation, he would go back to jail for a really long time and she would get everything. But when her efforts failed and Michael didn't get arrested and sent back to jail, Dahlia moved on to Plan B. She reached out to one of her ex-boyfriends and asked him a chilling question. She asked him if he knew any hitmen that could murder her husband. At first, the ex-boyfriend didn't think she was serious, but she kept asking him about it. She started offering to pay for it. She was making it very clear that she wasn't joking around. So the ex-boyfriend basically told her no, he didn't know any hitmen. And then he hung up the phone and called the Boynton Beach Police Department. He told them everything about Dahlia and her plan to hire a hitman to kill her husband, Michael. When the police found out about this plot, they immediately had one of their undercover agents pose as a hitman. They set up a meeting with Dahlia. That undercover agent was the huge guy in handcuffs who was just led into the interrogation room with her. Dahlia had gone to meet this fake hitman. She got into his car, and there was a hidden camera in the back seat filming her the entire time. She was caught on camera saying she wanted to kill her husband. She gave money to the undercover agent as a down payment. Then, just as she was about to get out of the car, the agent turned to her. He said, "Are you sure you want to do this? Because as soon as you leave this car, it's done. I am going to kill Michael, and you can't stop it." Dahlia's reaction was captured on film. She said, "It's not changing. No. There's no positive 5,000% sure." She went on to say, "No, when I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. As soon as he told me about getting the money from you, I went and I grabbed it right away. We were good to go. With me, you're not going to have a problem. You're not going to have an issue." So, the Boynton Beach Police Department now had all this information. They knew exactly what Dahlia thought was going to happen. And they decided they could use this information to set her up in the most elaborate way possible. And as it just so happened, the very popular true crime TV show, Cops, was filming in the area at that time. So the police department allowed Cops to be a part of this elaborate setup. They got to film everything. So on the morning of August 5th, Dahlia got up and left her condo at 5:45 a.m. She headed to the gym, believing in her mind that the hitman would be coming to her condo right after she left. She thought he would break in and shoot her husband twice in the head because that was the plan they had agreed on, the plan that was captured on film. As soon as the police who were monitoring the condo saw her leave, they rushed in. They knocked on the door and got Michael to come downstairs. Michael had absolutely no idea that his wife was trying to have him killed. He came to the door, totally confused, but he went with the officers. They ushered him off to the police station for his safety. Then, for about the next hour, the police set up a very convincing fake crime scene right in front of the condo. Once everything was in place, that's when the detective called Dahlia and left her that voicemail saying there had been an incident and she needed to come back. A couple of minutes later, when Dahlia called him back and said she was on her way, that's when the TV crews for the Cops show set up their cameras in the bushes and got ready to film what happened next. The detective's words to her were recorded. "Listen, we had a report of a disturbance at your house and there were shots fired." Dahlia asked, "Is your husband Michael okay?" And the detective delivered the line, "I'm sorry to tell you, ma'am, he's been killed." Back in the interrogation room, after the fake hitman was pulled out and Dahlia had denied knowing him, the detective just stared at her in total silence for a minute. And then he broke the news. He told her he knew all about her murder-for-hire plot and that she was going to jail. He told her, "You're under arrest." That's an undercover police officer. Everything has been recorded. You were photographed in the convertible when you sat in his car in front of CBS. She started to deny it, saying, "I didn't do anything." The detective cut her off. "You're going to jail. Don't tell me you didn't do anything. You're going to jail today. As soon as I'm done, they're going to come in here and handcuff you and take you to the Palm Beach County Jail. We're going to book you for solicitation of first-degree murder on your husband. Your husband is well and alive." Dahlia's response was a disbelieving, "Oh, yes. Thank God." The detective continued, "Thank God. He doesn't want to see you." After Dahlia was arrested, while she was still sitting in that interrogation room, the Boynton Beach Police Department made a special point of walking her husband, Michael, past the open door so she could see him. Her reaction was caught on tape. "Oh my God, he's alive! Come here, please. Come here, please. Come here. Come here, please. Come here." "Why not?" "I heard you, Mike. Come here, please. Come here." Dahlia was initially sentenced to 20 years in prison for what she had done. But after a retrial, which was granted because of jury bias in her first trial, her sentence was reduced to 16 years. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.